On the 1st of February 2012, Samantha Koenig was finishing her shift at the coffee place where she worked. It had been a day like any other for the 18-year-old barista, and since things were quiet, the long, uneventful day winding down, she'd already begun tidying up the Common Ground stand in downtown Anchorage, Alaska. That was when a man approached her, a figure wearing a ski mask, who was set on turning this average day into one unlike any other, ending it in an unspeakable tragedy. The man placed an order for a coffee. Despite it almost being the end of her working day, Samantha obliged and started making his order, expecting that it would be the last one of the day. And in a sense, it would be. While it might seem somewhat unnerving and even possibly a cause for concern to be approached at your place of employment by a stranger wearing a ski mask, most employees at retail outlets or financial services like banks might be expecting that someone with a mask is trying to conceal their identity, possibly so they could rob the establishment. But with the freezing cold temperatures in Alaska, it's hardly an unwarranted assumption that this figure was just trying to keep his face warm. But in actuality, the mask was to keep his face hidden from what was about to happen next. Samantha Koenig finished making the man's coffee and went to hand him the order. Then, without warning, he pulled out a gun. The barista was terrified for her life as the masked figure began to threaten her, demanding she hand over the money from the coffee stand's register. Trying to comply with his demands as quickly as possible, Samantha hurriedly went to empty the cash drawer and give the money to the assailant, only to find that the register was empty. She was perhaps hoping that he'd run off, having failed his attempt at a holdup, leaving her still frightened but ultimately still alive. Sadly, that wasn't what happened. Despite doing as he had instructed, Samantha was then made to put her hands up and kneel down on the ground. She was horrified to see the armed man suddenly dive into the kiosk, forcing his way inside the coffee stand, before grabbing her and using zip ties to bind her hands together. Once he had Samantha tied, her attacker pulled her to her feet and guided her outside to a white Ford Focus that was parked nearby. He took her toward the vehicle and tried to push Samantha inside, which was when she made an attempt to get away from the man. It didn't work. In retaliation, he pressed the barrel of the gun he was holding right against her head and warned that if she tried to escape again, he'd shoot her. Forcing her into the car, the assailant got behind the wheel and drove off, with Samantha in tow, her hands still bound and unable to flee for fear of being killed. The masked figure explained while driving through town that he didn't intend to cause Samantha any harm and that he only kidnapped her to demand a ransom. He told her that as long as she cooperated, she would eventually be returned to her family alive and unharmed. Bringing Samantha to his home, it was here that her kidnapper would hold her captive for several days. He kept her tied up in a shed on his property and turned the radio up to full volume in order to drown out the sound of his captive screaming, preventing any neighbors or passers-by from hearing her cries for help and intervening. Immediately after imprisoning her, the man later drove back to the coffee kiosk he'd taken Samantha from to retrieve her phone. Her boyfriend, Dwayne Tortolani, was due to be picking her up from work after her shift. The kidnapper had initially intended to capture Dwayne too, but had changed his mind and decided only to take Samantha instead. But he still had to cover his tracks and delay his victim's loved ones from discovering that she was missing. So he retrieved Samantha's phone and sent a fake text message to Dwayne telling him, "I'm spending a couple days with friends, let my dad know." The day after the kidnapping, the kidnapper demanded that Samantha give him her address so he could break in and steal her ATM card. She told him where she lived and even that the card was in her boyfriend's truck. So the man made his way over to Samantha's home and broke into Dwayne's truck. Sure enough, there was a debit card right there for the taking, linked to an account that Samantha and her boyfriend shared. The kidnapper pocketed the card and was about to make his exit when somebody spotted him. Dwayne Tortolani had already been on edge since receiving the vague text message from his girlfriend the night before, with no idea that Samantha hadn't been the one to send it. When Dwayne and Samantha's dad, James Koenig, witnessed someone who appeared to be a burglar attempting to steal his truck, they confronted the man, running inside the house to get James's help. But by the time they'd returned, the thief had fled from the scene. Neither Dwayne nor James realized they'd just seen the man responsible for Samantha's disappearance. Once the kidnapper had successfully tested Samantha and Dwayne's debit card, making sure it still worked, he returned to his home and his captive victim. There, he poured himself a tall glass of wine and headed out to his shed, where he violently forced himself on Samantha. Afterward, he strangled her to death. The man who kidnapped and killed Samantha Koenig was named Israel Keys. To those on the outside looking in on the man's life, he was unassuming, just a father to a daughter and a reliable handyman, a contractor, and a construction worker with his own business, Keys Construction. But since the details of his heinous actions were brought to life, he's been called by some The most meticulous serial killer of the 21st century. Make no mistake, Israel Keyes was a monster wearing the mask of a man and one responsible for a whole laundry list of serious crimes, from burglary and bank robbery to arson, kidnappings, with his serial killings claiming the lives of between 11 and 20 victims, as well as his numerous aggravated sexual assaults added to the already degenerate pile. His crime spree toured the breadth of the United States as early as 1996, only ending after 2012 when the FBI learned about what he'd done to Samantha Koenig, and what they uncovered made them utterly terrified of Israel Keyes. Once he had murdered Samantha, Keyes would leave her body stashed in a cupboard inside the shed where he'd been keeping her prisoner. After all, he had places to be and a flight to catch. The next morning, he woke up his daughter, who was only 11 at the time, and left for the airport. He traveled down from Alaska to New Orleans to board a ship that took him on a pre-planned cruise around the Gulf of Mexico, which lasted for around 2 weeks. At the culmination of the New Orleans cruise, Keyes was starting to get increasingly worried. In the short time he'd been away, his abduction of Samantha had garnered a lot of publicity, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. Rather than returning home directly to Anchorage, Keyes figured that perhaps the best way he could draw attention away from the crime he'd committed back in Alaska was to commit more crimes somewhere else. He began exploring parts of Dallas, Texas, intent on launching a full-blown crime spree. Soon enough, in Aledo, he came across a single-story house. It was a 3,500 square foot property, complete with red bricks and a barn nearby. Once he had successfully robbed the house, Keyes set fire to the barn, burning it to the ground. After arson around Aledo, Keyes drove to another nearby Texas city, this time making a pit stop in Azle. Was he there to take in the local sights? Maybe visit the Ain't That Something antique store? No, he was there to knock over the National Bank of Texas. Putting on sunglasses, a breathing mask, and a hard hat, as well as a pair of gloves, Keyes marched into the bank with the same handgun he used to threaten Samantha Koenig. He brandished the weapon at the teller, robbing the place within approximately 2 minutes and racing off before the police had time to arrive on scene. Later, Keyes would bury the money he'd stolen in a hole that he dug in the Post Oak Cemetery, located in Glen Rose, Texas. Still on his return journey back to Alaska and still mid-crime spree, Keyes even came close to carrying out yet another kidnapping. While he was in an area of Texas just south of Cleburne, he spotted a woman who was out walking her dog. For a moment, Keyes considered abducting her too, and even almost did, but ultimately quickly gave up on that plan and instead focused on making his way back to Anchorage. On the 17th of February 2012, Keyes arrived back home in Alaska. Now, while it might seem that his original plan to kidnap and hold Samantha for ransom was just a lie Keyes told the teenager while he abducted her, that was still very much his intention, and the fact that he'd already murdered Samantha wasn't about to stop him from trying to get his hands on the ransom money. At the time, after all, despite the publicity her disappearance had drummed up, the police and the Koenig family had no clue that Samantha was already dead. So Keyes enacted arguably one of the most horrific parts of his twisted plan. He took Samantha's lifeless body out of the cupboard he left her in, then applied makeup to her frozen face. Unsettlingly, he sewed her eyes with a fishing line so they would stay open, giving the impression that his victim was still alive. He then wrote a ransom note demanding that $30,000 be deposited into the shared account belonging to Samantha and her boyfriend. Keyes still had the ATM card for the account in his possession, which would allow him to withdraw money should the family accept his demands. Then he snapped a Polaroid of Samantha's body, giving the appearance of still being alive, and holding up a 4-day-old issue of the Anchorage Daily newspaper. Having it visible in the frame proved the photo had been taken recently and would, according to Keyes' plan, make it seem like the deceased woman was still alive. Both the photo of her body and the note containing his ransom demand were then left at an Anchorage park underneath a memorial flyer for a dog named Albert. This was where Keyes instructed Dwayne Tortolani to look for further instructions using Samantha's phone. The message ominously read, "Connor Park sign, under pic of Albert, ain't she purty?" A few days after leaving the photo and a ransom note for Dwayne to find, Keyes disposed of Samantha's body. He drove her out to Matanuska Lake, a lake just north of Anchorage that was covered with a sheet of ice during this time of year. Taking Samantha's body out of his truck, Keyes then meticulously dismembered her corpse using a chainsaw before cutting a hole in the ice and dumping her severed remains in the freezing lake. Around this time, Dwayne found the ransom note left in Connor Park and shared it with Samantha's father, James, as well as the rest of the family. Believing Samantha was still alive, deceived by Keyes' sickening photo of her body, James deposited the requested sum of $30,000 into the account that Keyes now had access to. Members of the local community had generously donated as much as they could to help, sparing the Koenigs from paying the entire ransom out of pocket. But of course, this was all done under the false assumption that Samantha would be returned to them if they coughed up the cash to Keyes. The killer and kidnapper started accessing Samantha and Dwayne's shared accounts and gradually withdrawing the ransom money from the 6th of March onward. This alerted Alaskan police, as well as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Given the severe nature of the crime committed, the FBI had also begun to investigate the case, and as a result, they were monitoring any activity on the account where the ransom money had been deposited. Shortly after Keyes started collecting his ill-gotten gains, he started making his way through the southwestern states. In Alaska, he was not only too close to where he'd left Samantha's body, but staying in one place would make it easier for police to catch up with him. This did little to deter the authorities from tracking where in the southwestern U.S. he was making the numerous withdrawals of ransom money. Authorities in Alaska had made the controversial decision not to release the surveillance footage of Samantha's abduction to the public, which is often done to encourage citizens to come forward with any relevant information if they recognize familiar figures or details from the footage of a crime under investigation. However, without the assistance of the public, police were able to determine that the man responsible for both the kidnapping of Samantha Koenig and the robbery at the National Bank of Texas had been driving a white 2012 Ford Focus. Officers in Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were alerted to keep an eye on a vehicle that matched the description. The car that Keyes had been using was a rental vehicle. Somewhat ironically, he tried to obtain a replacement to better cover his tracks, only to receive another Ford Focus, the same model and even the same color. This would eventually lead to the authorities arresting him after a Texas Highway Patrol officer spotted Keyes and the vehicle on the 13th of March. The officer alerted Texas police and began following the white car onto Highway 59, having noticed that the driver was traveling above the speed limit. The Highway Patrol officer made his presence known to Keyes, getting the kidnapper to pull over to the side of the road. The moment he stopped, a fleet of unmarked vehicles raced to the scene, federal agents and Texas Rangers pouring out of their cars and surrounding him. Israel Keyes had nowhere left to run. In a quick search of the murderous car later, authorities had found Samantha Koenig's debit card along with her cell phone, which Keyes had removed the battery from to prevent it from being traced. Also in the car were a ski mask, Keyes' gun, and cash that he'd taken from the National Bank of Texas, distinguishable by the anti-theft dye that stained the bills. Keyes also had maps of California, Arizona, and New Mexico, with certain areas highlighted. Israel Keyes was subsequently arrested at the scene and indicted in a federal holding facility located in Beaumont, Texas. On the 26th of March, he was returned to Anchorage and confessed to murdering Samantha Koenig. During subsequent interviews with the police, Keyes conducted himself with an unsettling level of calm and patience, even offering up terms to the authorities in exchange for confessions of his various other crimes. It turned out that, unbeknownst to law enforcement, Samantha Koenig was not Keyes' first victim. He offered to divulge the information regarding the crimes he had committed, and even agreed that he would plead guilty to any and all charges that were brought against him. But Keyes laid out that he'd only agree to do so as long as his trial lasted less than a year and that he was sentenced to execution at the end of it. Naturally, police don't, or certainly shouldn't, be able to influence the outcome of the judicial process, so promising a specific outcome in Keyes' trial was a little far out of the police's jurisdiction. Still, federal investigators eventually struck a deal with Israel Keyes to learn about where the bodies of his other potential prior victims were hidden. Keyes willingly agreed to reveal all, but there was one other important caveat to his doing so. He didn't want the public or the media to know any of the details about his crimes, because Keyes didn't want his daughter to learn about what he had done to Samantha. On the 2nd of April 2012, 2 months and a day after she had been kidnapped at work, Samantha Koenig's remains were recovered from Matanuska Lake. What Keyes had done to her ultimately led to him being discovered and resulted in his eventual downfall, with some federal agents even being convinced that had Keyes not kidnapped and murdered Samantha, he might never have been caught at all. As the information he later revealed to authorities would confirm, Israel Keyes' criminal exploits had been going on much longer than anyone realized. His vile actions were more akin to the villain of a horror movie than an actual human being. The FBI realized they weren't dealing with an opportunistic murderer, but a cold, calculating, highly methodical, and downright terrifying serial killer. So who exactly was Israel Keyes? How had a man guilty of so much violence and murder been able to avoid being found? Where does a monster like that even come from? Well, this specific monster was born in Richmond, Utah in 1978. The Keyes family home, the second child of 9 siblings, certainly got crowded after his parents, John Jeffrey Keyes and Heidi Hackinson, had him. Keyes was raised Mormon, although he would often attend a Christian church that espoused white supremacist beliefs. As if being exposed to a hateful ideology at such a young age wasn't enough to turn Keyes into a monster, he seemed to adopt a fixation with weapons in his early adolescence. From the age of 14, he would walk around everywhere with a .38 caliber revolver that his grandfather gave him. As a child, Keyes outfitted the weapon with his very own homemade silencer and began killing pet animals in true child destined to be a serial killer fashion. His propensity for burglary would also begin around this time when he and a friend would break into local houses and steal valuables. By 1995, at the age of around 17, Keyes started working with a construction crew up until the late 90s when his family moved to Maine. It was there that he'd announced to his parents he was an atheist, leading to him being kicked out of the home of his highly religious family. But it was around this time in his life, some point between 96 and 1998, that Keyes would commit his first serious crime, and it was a grim warning of the type of heinous act he'd spend much of his life carrying out. A hiking group had been making their way along the Deschutes River near Maupin, Oregon, when they noticed that one of their members, a girl, had gone missing. The group started to search the surrounding area, attempting to track the missing hiker down. But as it turned out, Israel Keyes had found her first. Keyes abducted the girl from the other hikers and then forced himself on her. Later, he released her, although he had intended to murder her, until she convinced him to let her leave. It seems he wasn't yet adding kidnapping and killing to his already deplorable modus operandi, although he would later be quoted as saying, "I wasn't violent enough. I made up my mind I was never going to let that happen again." In 1998, Keyes enlisted in the U.S. Army after relocating to New Jersey and would serve as a specialist within Alpha Company's 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry. He trained in Egypt, spending much of his service in Fort Hood, Texas, and near Tacoma, Washington, over in Fort Lewis. He earned an Army Achievement Medal for his meritorious service while he had been assigned as a gunner, manning a 60mm mortar between December 1998 and July 2001. In May 2001, Keyes encountered legal trouble when he was charged with driving under the influence in Thurston County, Washington. Compounding the issue, authorities discovered that his driving license had already been suspended, resulting in an additional charge for driving with a suspended license. Though less severe than his other offenses, these infractions led to his dishonorable discharge from the U.S. Army later that year. While discharge from the armed forces would be devastating to some, for Keyes it offered him a chance to pursue his true passion. His new lease on life was largely focused on ending other people's lives. Upon his arrest, he confessed to the FBI that shortly after his military discharge, he took the lives of his first murder victims, a couple whose identity still remains unverified. In 2000, Keyes became involved with a woman living on the Washington Makah Reservation, and their daughter was born a year later. By the following year, 2002, Keyes had separated from the still unnamed woman and took his daughter away to live with him. Then, as of 2006, he began taking a number of travels away, visiting parts of California, Washington, and New England, never specifying the reason as to why. When he made his confession to law enforcement in 2012, Keyes was confirmed to have committed a number of burglaries, taking place in between 20 to 30 different homes, as well as conducting robberies in several other banks. The time he robbed the National Bank of Texas certainly wasn't a one and done. One of the most notable of those took place in 2009, when Keyes decided that in order to finance his crimes, the quickest way to secure some funds was to rob a bank, as one does naturally. He had allegedly abducted and killed a man in New York not long before. Then, on April 10, 2009, Keyes made his way toward the community bank. He was said to have been wearing a jacket and jeans, gray shoes, two-tone gloves, sunglasses, and a fake mustache and goatee to complete the look. Oh, and a couple of accessories, a .40 caliber semi-automatic Smith & Wesson handgun, and a .22 caliber Ruger Charger pistol as a spare. Heading inside with his weapons at the ready, he successfully made off with the cash he needed. However, rather than get spending, Keyes had a different approach. Stashing the stolen money in a toolbox, he then buried it in the Woodside Natural area of Essex, Vermont. Along with the cash, he buried both his Smith & Wesson and Ruger Charger, along with homemade silencers, ligatures, ammunition for both guns, and some garbage bags. 4 days later, he flew back home and made several repeat travels across America over the next 2 years. In 2011, he flew to Indiana, then drove to New York, and later back to Vermont. Recovering his hidden toolbox, he prepared to target and murder another victim as a prelude to another bank robbing spree, with maybe some arson thrown in as an added treat. Prowling around suburban neighborhoods late on the 8th of July 2011, Keyes eventually set his sights on Bill and Lorraine Currier. Having observed which room of the house the couple were asleep in, Keyes cut their phone lines and broke inside. He then enacted what he would later call a blitz attack on the couriers, ambushing them as they slept, tying them up and then driving them out to an abandoned farmhouse that he'd previously found in the area. After shooting Bill Courier with a .22 caliber Ruger, Keyes forced himself on Lorraine before strangling her. Neither of their bodies were ever found. Where Keyes was different from many other serial killers was exactly how he went about conducting his crimes. Rather than attacking victims spontaneously, he instead meticulously planned out each of his murders, spending ample time and taking extreme caution to avoid detection. And it seemed to work for almost his entire killing career, since the police and the FBI didn't make any headway in even discovering his crimes until he kidnapped and killed Samantha Koenig in 2012. What also made him far more difficult to track down than other serial killers was that there was little linking Keyes' various victims, even the ones that authorities had actually found. Statistically, murders are typically carried out by somebody that the victim is considerably familiar with or a person who is at least known to the deceased. But when it came to Keyes, he had no prior connection whatsoever with any of his victims. The idea of a total stranger just deciding, apropos of nothing, that they're going to end your life because you just happened to cross their path is genuinely the stuff of paranoid nightmares. Keyes would lie in wait and search for victims in parks, cemeteries, campgrounds, or other similarly isolated areas away from the prying eyes of potential witnesses or surveillance cameras that are far more common in populated urban areas. When describing his reasoning to the police, he explained that there weren't as many people to choose from in areas like these. He confessed to law enforcement that the lack of anyone else around to see what he was doing was what drew him to the places and the people he targeted. There's also no witnesses, really. There's no one else around. He never went after victims that fit a specific profile, targeting men and women, although when interviewed by police in 2012, he claimed that he considered children and their parents to be off-limits. How altruistic of him. Despite these claims, the FBI still suspected Keyes had been involved with the killing of several teenagers and children. In addition, the fact that Keyes moved around a lot, constantly traveling away to enact his brutal acts, made it initially hard to link his crimes to each other. If a death occurs in Vermont and another takes place in Washington, it might be considered by police to be a bit of a leap to assume the same person did them, let alone entertain the idea that they were the work of a notorious serial killer. State to state, unless making requests for relevant information, police departments might not even be aware of the crimes committed elsewhere in the country. Keyes would always enact his killings far away from wherever he currently called home, and would never murder someone in the same area twice, making it even harder to connect what must have looked like several separate deaths, especially when he killed with no apparent motive or discernible pattern. Months of preparation and planning went into his attacks. During his various trips to different states, he would only pay in normally stolen cash and kept his cell phone switched off at all times. Once Keyes had selected a victim at random, he would bury a quote murder kit somewhere in the area where his target was, just like he did before killing the couriers. Some of these kits have been recovered in parts of Alaska and New York, but Keyes also confessed that he had stashed others across Washington, Wyoming, Texas, and Arizona. Also, according to his confessions, he rarely used firearms, relying on them to carry out a killing only when he had to. Keyes admitted to deriving a lot of pleasure from watching his victims lose consciousness in a struggle, preferring instead to strangle them to death. When the police questioned him as he confessed to his crimes, Keyes revealed one of the core details that made the FBI so afraid of him. He'd studied the crimes of other serial killers. According to Keyes, in his youth, he had read Mindhunter inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit, a book that features profiles of various serial killers from a former FBI agent, and since then had developed an affinity for his fellow killers. In one interview, investigators mentioned Robert Hansen, another serial killer who happened to have also been active in Anchorage, Alaska, between 1972 and 1983, otherwise known as the Butcher Baker. Hearing mention of Hansen, Keyes enthusiastically told authorities, "Yeah, I know all about him. I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby of mine." In particular, it was said that he deeply admired Ted Bundy, even claiming that he saw himself in him and shared many similarities with the notorious murderer. While it was true that Keyes and Bundy were both methodical and operated in multiple U.S. states, they clearly differed in how they chose their victims and how they operated. Even though part of the reason Keyes didn't want his name given to the media was to avoid being labeled as a copycat of his serial killer role model, He would even go so far as to try to imitate Bundy's escape from court later in 2012, but was immediately seized by guards. Keyes didn't hold all his fellow serial killers in such high regard, though. He said of Dennis Rader, also known as BTK, that he was a wimp for showing remorse for his killings. Keyes expressed the most admiration for other serial killers who hadn't been caught like he very nearly was. One homicide detective from Anchorage, Detective Monique Dahl, said that Keyes didn't kidnap and kill people because he was crazy. He didn't kidnap and kill people because his deity told him to or because he had a bad childhood. He did this because he got an immense amount of enjoyment out of it. Much like an addict gets an immense amount of enjoyment out of drugs, in a way he was an addict, and he was addicted to the feeling that he got when he was out doing this. When investigators asked Keyes why he had committed his crimes, he simply replied by asking them, why not? It wouldn't be until August 2013, over a year after he had killed Samantha Koenig, that federal authorities released information about Israel Keyes to the public. They announced that he was suspected to have a grand total of 11 slain victims, each having been killed between 2001 and 2012. There was also speculation that he'd claimed the lives of even more people, possibly up in Canada, where Keyes had often targeted prostitutes, as well as potential killings he'd committed in other countries. However, these were either too far out of federal jurisdiction or happened too long ago for the FBI to be able to fully substantiate them. Israel Keyes was said to have a body count of at least 11 innocent people, although he confessed to as many as 20. Still, only 3 of his victims have ever been confirmed and formally identified, those being the Couriers, Bill and Lorraine, and Samantha Koenig. There exists an entire list of speculated Keyes additional victims too, including multiple teenage girls from Colville found dead in 1997, the Lewis County Jane Doe found in 2011 in Morton, and a body that was ruled as an accidental drowning in a lake in Nia Bay. And those are just the possible victims from Washington. When information about him was released to the public, Keyes became uncooperative with investigators and threatened to stop speaking with the FBI entirely. During a routine court hearing in 2012, he even became violent, which was when he was able to escape confinement and attempted to attack spectators in the courtroom. Following this, security measures were increased. Keyes had an escort of 2 officers every time he left his cell, full restraints, and daily strip searches since there were no restrictions on what items he could have in his possession, such as pencils and, crucially, razors. Yet despite these measures, he was still able to sneak a razor blade on his person, which was believed to have been issued to him by mistake, since he was only authorized to shave with an electric razor. On December 2, 2012, Keyes wrote a 2-page note before using a combination of the razor and hanging to end his own life. While he was never formally sentenced for his numerous crimes, Israel Keyes at least faced some kind of justice, no longer able to harm anybody else. In the early 1940s, the Nazis controlled Paris, but even then they were terrified of a depraved maniac whose body count might have been as high as 150. The cops wanted him. The Nazis really wanted him, but this highly educated psychopath wasn't so easy to catch. This is the story of a man who became known as Dr. Satan, and it's arguably one of the most messed up tales we've ever told. Let's start at the beginning. 1940 was a bad time for most Parisians. Before those German tanks made their way into the city, around 2 million residents of Paris had already moved out. For those left behind and who understood the perils of Nazism, it was a depressing time. Their bones chilled as they watched the swastika flag fly above the Arc de Triomphe. Some of these were people who'd be spied on by the Gestapo and, worse, interrogated and possibly killed. It was a time of great fear and paranoia, so the last thing anyone needed was a serial killer to add to their woes. A man that left decapitated heads and other body parts for the cops to find. Nonetheless, Dr. Satan was a hero to many, albeit folks who were continually fooled by him. As for the Nazis, it would be reasonable to say that the evil doctor was always one step ahead of them. His real name was Marcel Petiot. How he ever became a doctor boggles the mind, which is something we'll think you'll agree with after you hear about his strange life from childhood to adulthood. He was born in the French city of Auxerre on January 17, 1897, and he was a delinquent at a young age. At age 11, he brought a gun to school and used it to threaten a girl. He got involved with theft, smashed up public property, and he did terrible things to small animals. It said he also put on a kind of circus act one time in school, standing against a locked door in class and throwing knives at the other students. It's not surprising then that he was deemed mentally ill by child psychiatrists. According to the book Death in the City of Light, the serial killer of Nazi-occupied Paris, he got expelled from school a few times as a teenager and so was evaluated by professionals who said this kid is just not right in the head. His parents, of course, were very concerned, telling doctors that he wet the bed and had occasional convulsive fits. They were also a bit worried about his constant sleepwalking. If you were to ask an expert now, they might assume this kid at some point had a serious head injury, and that's what caused all the problems. A psychiatrist in 1914 seemed to suggest that his frontal lobes weren't working right, stating that he was an abnormal youth who didn't take responsibility for his acts. As you'll see, nothing really changed when he became an adult. Still, he ended up at a special Paris academy, and later in 1916, when he was 19 years old, he went to fight for the French army in the trenches of World War I. What could possibly go wrong? A kid with mental health problems and a proclivity for violence being hired to murder people. Physicians among the French forces said what others had said before. Petiot had some serious mental health issues. The kid wasn't fit to fight. He was already walking close to the edges of sanity when he was gassed and wounded in battle, after which it said he had a complete breakdown. At first, he was sent to homes where he could be looked after properly, but then he took up the bad habit of stealing morphine and other supplies, including people's personal stuff and their letters and photos from loved ones. For that, he got some jail time, but after being professionally diagnosed with more than one mental illness, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. It was those diagnoses that kept him out of prison, with doctors saying he wasn't a criminal but mentally ill. One psychiatrist wrote in a report that he suffered from mental disequilibrium, neurasthenia, mental depression, melancholia, obsessions, and phobias. If you're wondering what neurasthenia means, it's basically a term for being persistently mentally disturbed. After 3 weeks' leave, he went back to the army. During his stint, he complained of headaches and blackouts, memory loss, and sleepwalking. At first, he was let go from the forces and given a 40% disability pension, but then after review got 100% pension. He was then sent to the asylum, a place he'd one day say he was a doctor, not a patient. In 1919, he was finally released from that institution. The war was over, he was 22 years old. You could say it was time for a new beginning. Although the doctors that had seen this young man and studied his temperament said it was important that he was kept under continuous surveillance. That didn't happen. Being mentally ill or having a personality disorder just doesn't necessarily mean a person can't do well in life. Look at the other lives of many serial killers that you all know well. Some of them excelled in certain areas, and while they were busy cutting up victims, they held down decent jobs, and some had a wife and children at home who loved them dearly. So it was that Monsieur Petiot joined an accelerated medical education program for war veterans, and he absolutely nailed the exams. He landed an internship at a hospital, and by the time December 1921 rolled around, he could proudly say he was the owner of a medical degree. He then set up a practice in his town of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, a lovely little place in the Burgundy region, and a place that would feel the wrath of Petiot's violence. Now he was a professional, but his mental health issues were still there. He'd even got arrested for stealing at one point, but he kept his job. Petiot very likely had a touch of the psychopath in him. We say that for various reasons, with one being that he was very cunning and absolutely without a conscience. He needed more patience, so he went about saying he was one of the best doctors in town. He printed flyers that said so. One of them said, "Dr. Petiot is young, and only a young doctor can keep up to date on the latest methods born of a progress which marches with giant strides. This is why intelligent patients have confidence in him. Dr. Petiot treats but does not exploit his patients." That could not have been further from the truth. He charmed his way into getting a long list of patients who he enrolled in a government program, thereby ensuring he got paid once by them and once by the government. It said someone would come to his practice with a regular kind of illness and he'd say, "Here's some morphine, that should fix it." No doubt it helped, but opiates are generally not the first line of treatment for a bad cold or a bout of tonsillitis. One time, the recipient of his morphine was just a kid, and the kid almost died from an overdose. When a pharmacist told Petiot that in no way should he be giving opiates to children for minor problems, he replied, "What difference does it make to you anyway? Isn't it better to do away with this kid who's not doing anything in the world but pestering his mother?" Now, we should say right here that when Bayer first started marketing heroin in the late 19th century, one of its uses was to give kids help with their coughs. Heroin is basically strong morphine. It worked, because the drug tends to work in many ways, but it also was highly addictive and dangerous as hell. So while Petiot might have had a point about morphine being an excellent product to shut up talkative kids, he shouldn't have been doing what he was doing. Those frontal lobes, it seems, were still not doing their job and helping this man think about the consequences of his actions. He spent most of his time alone, only coming out to drive his sports car and occasionally smashing it into other cars. It was at this time in his life that he stole from his brother Marcel and was kicked out of his rented accommodation for theft. In 1922, the Commission de Réforme told him that he had to undergo a new examination regarding his disability pension. A doctor later said his tongue was badly injured because he was always biting it during his convulsions. He added that Petiot had an indifference about his life and the way it was going. How he kept his job as a doctor beggars belief, and more so because he was even allowed to claim 50% of his disability pension. Well, guess it was the 1920s, you could get away with such things back then. He began an affair with the daughter of one of his patients, a young woman named Louise Delaveau. After a few months, she disappeared. Neighbors of Petiot told the cops that they'd seen him putting what looked like a really heavy package into the back of his car. The police looked into this but concluded that Delaveau had probably just skipped town. It was certainly a strange case though, seeing that at the time Delaveau's parents' home was broken into and burned to the ground. Later, something that looked like the trunk Petiot had stuffed into the back of his car that day was pulled out of a river in the town. Inside it was the badly decomposed remains of a young woman. But this being the 1920s, the cops didn't have ways of properly identifying the body. Undoubtedly, this was his first murder, although it was never proven. If this story couldn't get any crazier, and we promise you it's going to go off the rails, Petiot decided that he wanted to be the town mayor. Being the trusted town doctor, he actually won the mayorship, but only after he paid some guy to spoil his opponent's speech when the two were debating. At one point, just after he finished his own speech, the town lights all went out and a bunch of fires were started. That was the work of Petiot's man, and when the votes were counted, it was revealed he'd won by a landslide. During his time as mayor, he got busy stealing again, and among other things, he took a drum from the town band and a stone cross that he didn't like much. When he was accused of this, he said he was the best mayor the town had ever had, and those accusations were just his political enemies reeling with envy and trying to taint his good name. In 1927, age 30, he married a 23-year-old woman named Georgette Lablé. You probably wouldn't be too surprised to hear that she was the daughter of a wealthy landowner in the region. They had a kid together, Gerhard, and things were looking up. Even so, Petiot was accused of stealing oil from the town's railroad depot. He was fined 200 francs and sentenced to 3 months in prison, but he managed to get that decision reversed. In 1930, there was a huge fire at the house of a dairy unionist named Armand Debouve. When the flames were finally out, his wife was found inside, having been beaten to death with what cops said was a blunt instrument. 20,000 francs were missing too, and police found footprints leading from the house back to the nearby town of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. On top of that, there were rumors going around that the dead woman had been the mistress of none other than Monsieur Petiot. He'd even been seen near her home on the night of the fire. The witness who'd seen Petiot was Monsieur Fisco. He told the police that he would testify to that in court. But with not many doctors around, he had no choice but to visit Petiot's practice when his rheumatism was acting up. Fisco was given an injection, and 3 hours later, he was dead. Petiot said the man had an aneurysm. You're probably now seeing why he was nicknamed Dr. Satan, but we're just getting into the story. A few years later, all those complaints about him came to the fore, and he was forced to resign as mayor. People were so fooled by the guy that the council resigned with him, saying what had happened was just unfair. In 1932, he got a job on the council himself, but a year later he lost the seat because it had been found that he was stealing electricity. The case went to court with the judge saying Petiot's defense was nothing but a fantasy. He was subsequently sentenced to 15 days in jail and handed a 300 franc fine. As usual, Petiot appealed the decision, and later his jail time was suspended. In the end, he stayed out of jail and was only fined 100 francs. Still, that meant the end of his council seat and a bad reputation that was becoming harder to shake off. With his character now tarnished, he made the move to Paris, the city where his cruelty and criminality would soar to new heights. Petiot started what became a very popular practice on the Rue de Coumartin, using fake documents at times so that people thought he was the best doctor around for miles, handing out morphine for just about any condition or illness, which, as tends to happen with highly addictive drugs, had people queuing up every day to see him. He even had the audacity to counterfeit a document that claimed part of his work experience had been as an intern working at a certain mental health institution, although the truth was that he'd been a patient there, not part of the medical staff. He just changed the word interned to intern. As crazy as it sounds, he kept his job after being sent to a mental health facility for his stealing. Later, when he got out and was working again, he was given the médecin d'état civil so he could write death certificates. Now he could more easily knock people off. One of his victims was a 30-year-old woman named Raymonde Hans. She went to see Petiot about some painful abscess in her mouth, and it was decided that he'd surgically remove them. After the operation, she'd never again regain consciousness. He drove her home in that state, and she was pronounced dead a few hours later. Her mother, Madame Anna Coquille, said something just wasn't right here. Her daughter had been in good health despite the abscesses. She ordered an autopsy, and it was found that her daughter had been given a very high dose of morphine. This should have rung alarm bells, but after an investigation it was ruled that the woman had died of natural causes. Not long after, in 1936, Petiot was caught shoplifting, and then when a cop tried to arrest him, Petiot beat him up. It was after this event that the authorities started looking at him more seriously. He ended up in court again, this time crying his eyes out, saying he'd had one of his funny attacks. He told the court to look at his army record and the fact that he'd at times been mentally ill, and the court didn't charge him in the end, saying that instead he'd been hit with temporary insanity. Still, it pleased the court when they heard that Petiot's wife had arranged for him to spend some time in a sanatorium. Not long after he arrived there, he told doctors that he was actually in good shape mentally and he asked to be released. He said his lapse of madness was due to stress. He lied and said he'd been working on a machine for constipation, a device that literally sucked the poop out of people, and he said the stress of finishing the device had negatively affected his mental well-being. The main psychiatrist for the court wrote that Petiot was chronically imbalanced, but the judge concluded that Petiot was sane enough to go back into society. How very wrong he was. After his release at the beginning of 1937, he actually seemed to start adhering to the law, including taking a break from stealing. Still, his one big transgression was tax evasion, with him claiming he'd earned only about 10% of what he actually made. He went to court again for that, but again he turned on the waterworks, claiming he'd been driven to the crime because of poverty. And yet again, the psychopath walked out of court with a great big grin on his face. As you know, in 1939 war broke out, and in 1940 German tanks arrived in Paris. Marshal Philippe Pétain became the head of the Vichy government, and French life was about to change in many ways. For a lot of people, this was a distressing time, but for a psychopath, it afforded many new opportunities. One of Petiot's first moves was making fake medical certificates. You see, many French folks were told by the Nazis that they'd now be working for them, and that meant a kind of slave labor. It seems they could get out of this with a medical certificate, and Petiot was the man to go to for one of them. On face value, it looked as though he was on the side of the French resistance. He treated French people who'd been wounded or fallen ill in Germany, and through those people, he learned a lot about the movements of Nazis and the Gestapo that was busy trying to hunt resistance fighters. He helped spy on the Gestapo through something he called the Fly Talks Network. He then gave information to resistance fighters so they could assassinate members of the Gestapo. This is what he told people anyway. Maybe it sounds quite heroic to you, given what would have happened to Petiot if he'd been found out. The Nazis would very likely have tortured and killed him. But remember, he was a psycho, and because of this, he made up stories all the time to make it look like he was helping the resistance. He even told them he had some kind of super weapon that when used could kill a Nazi and make it look like death by natural causes. He told a big tale about working with some anti-fascist Spaniards in Paris, and he spun all kinds of lies about making bombs and booby traps with which he killed plenty of Nazis. All these stories only ever really happened inside his own head, but they were about to help him make lots of money. He started telling people, mainly Jews and resistance fighters, but even criminals, that he could get them safe passage out of France and to somewhere safe on another continent. All they had to do was hand him 25,000 francs. In 1941, he bought a house on Rue de Sueur and used it to hide these people before they were sent on one of his so-called underground railways to someplace like South America. Two of his customers were Joseph Riocreux and Adrien Estebetegui. These guys had been pimps, but what really irked the Nazis is that they committed an armed robbery while wearing Nazi uniforms. That was definitely a death sentence if they were caught. Petiot, now calling himself Dr. Eugène, told them no sweat. He could easily get them out of France. These two guys went to the house on Rue de Sueur, followed by their lovers and also another couple who were said to be a pimp and his prostitute, and presto, all 6 of these people did in fact disappear. But rather than spend time and money getting them to South America, Petiot took their money and killed them. They weren't the only ones to go to that house and not get what they wanted. In fact, so many people heard about this place where you could visit and then vanish that Petiot got quite the name. We don't need to tell you that he killed them all, but to others, it looked as though they'd safely escaped France. Even the Gestapo heard these rumors, with the commander saying this mysterious man had to be caught immediately. Gestapo documents that were later found noted that there was a great deal of talk in public about an organization which arranges clandestine crossings of the Spanish border by means of falsified Argentine passports. There was talk, but no one ever left Paris. Then the Nazis put a plan together to get the man. One of their agents named Robert Yotkum blackmailed a French Jew named Yvon Dreyfus. Dreyfus was told he had to find this guy and tell him he had the cash to pay for a quick exit out of France. The plan might have worked had Dreyfus ever been seen again after he talked with Petiot. He was certainly making hay while the sun didn't shine in Paris. He then killed a pregnant woman, and soon after he murdered a man named Dr. Paul Léon Braunberger, a Jew who paid Petiot for safe passage out of France. He also murdered Braunberger's wife, and Petiot did the same with 3 German Jews, all members of the Neller family. Soon after, the entire Wolf family just disappeared, as did a pimp and his mistress, Joseph Pierreschi and Josephine Aimée Grippe. More and more people went missing. These disappearances were investigated by the French, but for the Nazis, their beef was with a guy who was getting people out of France. They had no idea he was killing them, and had they known, they might not have been that bothered. He was saving them a job, not knowing they were still intent on catching him out, and so they devised a plan. In 1942, the French police started making a bunch of ugly discoveries. Body parts kept washing up from the River Seine. Heads, hands, arms, legs, and other body parts. That is, of course, because Petiot would have struggled to dump an entire body at once. It worked out well for him because it was hard to identify the bodies and not possible to link them to any murderer. Still, things were about to get quite difficult for Mr. Petiot. In 1943, his fake network was infiltrated by a Nazi collaborator named Charles Beretta. Beretta told the Nazis names of people who had applied to escape, but it seems he didn't have enough information to lead them directly to Petiot. Still, some names were enough though. 3 of them were Raoul Fourier, Edmond Pantard, and René Gustave Nezonde. Each was arrested and taken back to Gestapo HQ to be tortured. It didn't take long for them to spill the beans, each saying they paid a guy named Dr. Eugène 25,000 francs for safe passage out of France. Petiot was soon arrested by the Gestapo and tortured, although it's not certain if he let the Nazis know much about what he knew about the resistance. He was then sent to prison, although it seems they had only ever found his home and not his storing and killing house on Rue de Sueur. If they had, they'd have had quite the surprise. The question is, and it did come up later, was Petiot being heroic by not speaking to the Nazis? After what you've heard today, you'd likely say no, and you'd be correct. It's assumed that the only reason he did talk is the fact that he didn't really know anything. And anyway, if he told the Nazis about what his real line of business was, they'd probably have given him a pat on the back. So, he did 8 months in prison and was released when it became obvious he had nothing to tell. Now he had the best story of all, and one which made him seem very trustworthy among enemies of the Nazis. He now had torture scars and stories of prison. Business, he thought, while smiling, was about to boom. He was wrong. Very wrong. That's because on March 11, 1944, the neighbors of Petiot on the Rue de Sueur had finally had enough and went to the police saying they could no longer put up with the terrible stink coming from next door. The smell was unbearable, as if bodies were rotting in the house. They also complained about the smoke that was always billowing from the chimney. Police told the local firemen to check it out, and when they did, they found a large stove in the basement from which flames were in full flow. On inspection, they also saw that body parts were burning in the fire. They found bits and pieces of humans stored in bags and some other body parts in a quicklime pit. This was a real-life house of horrors, with enough parts to make up around 10 people. Not only that, but there were also suitcases everywhere containing the clothes of many different people. Even though this was wartime, it was still big news. France had a new madman on its hands. Petiot was now a wanted man, but let's remember that many of his friends and patients thought he was a French hero. They kind of ignored the news reports about bodies and hid Petiot, thinking he was still a great doctor and a devout enemy of the evil Nazis. Petiot moved around between these people, adopting new identities and doing all he could to change his appearance. If anyone asked, they told him that the only people he'd killed were informers and Nazis. This seemed true enough when he joined the French Forces of the Interior while calling himself Henri Valery. The FFI was basically the resistance in its later stage, for which Petiot had played part as captain leading interrogations. His stint didn't last long since Paris was soon liberated. But again, he saw an opportunity. He was captain after all. One day, some of his men went to the house of a wealthy mayor. There, they threatened the man and called him all sorts of names, including a Nazi collaborator. They took from him 2.5 million francs, and then they murdered him in cold blood. Some young folks had seen this, and they went to Captain Valery, Petiot, to complain. They explained about the murder and all that cash. Valery had said he'd taken care of the matter, although the men only spent a very short time behind bars. It seems the sequestered money just went missing. Only a few days later, the Resistance newspaper came out with a leading story about some killer and Nazi collaborator named Petiot. The story said he was a soldier of the Reich. At the same time, police in Paris were still looking for him. Valery was even hired to look for him, so Petiot was in fact looking for himself. He knew he had to get away, but he fell at the last hurdle. At precisely 10:15 a.m. on October 31st, he was recognized and arrested at a metro station in Paris. He was carrying a gun, a large amount of money, and at least 50 different documents covering a bunch of identities. In court, the defense argued that Petiot had only killed enemies of France and that those bodies at the house were not his doing. Petiot told the court that he'd only found out about them after his release from prison. but that they were likely the remains of collaborators killed by members of his patriotic network. He told them that he was indeed a great patriot, one of the best there was. But when stories of his bombing campaigns and killing Nazis with superweapons were investigated, it was revealed this was pure fantasy. Meanwhile, many members of the resistance said that they'd never seen him, and those that had said he'd done nothing to help them. Pétion was charged with killing 27 people and raking in the realm of 200 million francs in cash, gold, and jewelry. None of this bounty was ever found. Some of the experts involved believe that Pétion had murdered as many as 150 people. In the end, he admitted to killing 63 enemies of France, and as for all those missing people he hadn't killed, he said South America was a big place, and that's why those people were never found, adding that some of his victims were alive and well and just getting ready for the next war. In his psychopathic way, at one point the judge got angry with him because he wasn't paying attention and was instead doodling on some paper. He then looked up at the judge and said, "I'm listening, but it doesn't really interest me very much." When he was told he was to be executed, he didn't seem the least bit bothered. On the big day, May 25, 1946, he was said to have been very calm. He was asked if he wanted to see a priest, which he declined, stating that he wanted to take his baggage with him. A portable guillotine was then brought to the prison at around 3:30 a.m. When offered a glass of rum, which was protocol, he said no thanks, but he did take a last cigarette. His neck was shaved, his collar was cut, and his hands were tied. A witness to the execution later said he moved with ease, as though he were walking into his office for a routine appointment. His head was then placed on the machine and he uttered his last words, "Gentlemen, I ask you not to look, this will not be very pretty." At 5:05 a.m. the blade dropped, and as it did, Pétion smiled for the very last time. Some people later said there was still a smile on his face as his head fell into the basket. We hope you're ready, because you're about to learn who the worst people in America were. From serial killers who did unspeakable things to science experiments gone wrong, you won't believe what these 20 Americans did. Number 20 on our list is the American known as the Merchant of Misery. James DeWolf was the head of one of the largest slave importing families in America. Based out of Rhode Island, DeWolf amassed a huge fortune selling other humans. Normally, we think of slavery as happening in the southern states during early American history. However, DeWolf made his fortune by selling slaves in the northern territories. He was indicted for murder in 1790 for throwing a sick female slave overboard on one of his ships, but the charges were dropped. Anyone who dealt with the slave trade was a bad person, but making tons of money off of selling other people without any remorse makes James DeWolf one of the worst Americans ever. In the 1600s, William Stoughton was the judge that presided over many of the Salem witch trials. He was a crazed madman who saw witches around every corner. He's also the 19th worst American on our list. Stoughton had no legal training and was only educated for ministry. When women in Salem were accused of being witches, Stoughton presided over the trials. He had no intention of allowing the women representation or witnesses to defend them. Instead, Stoughton used his non-existent legal background to condemn the women on the basis of what he believed. He sent 19 people to the gallows to be hung for witchcraft, 14 of which were women. William Stoughton was the worst fake judge presiding over fake claims in American history. Sometimes we forget how terrible Americans were earlier in the country's history. The atrocities on other peoples, especially those native to the land, were sometimes unfathomable. John Chivington's name is one you've probably never heard before, but he's number 18 on our list of the worst Americans for what he did to native peoples. On November 29, 1864, Colonel John Chivington ordered the massacre of over 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho women, children, and elderly at Sand Creek, Colorado. They had already surrendered, but Chivington ordered his men to take no prisoners, and he watched as his troops slaughtered the defenseless indigenous people. And something to keep in mind as you try to grapple with this terrible American, he was also an ordained minister. For number 17, we come to an early American president. Presidents can be polarizing depending on who they are and what party they belong to. However, only one president did nothing as the United States literally got ripped apart. James Buchanan idly sat by as the southern states spread slavery further west after the Louisiana Purchase and Mexican War. During his inauguration, he vehemently supported the Dred Scott decision, in which the Supreme Court stated that Congress could not keep slavery out of newly acquired territories. Buchanan also refused to challenge states that intended to secede from the Union. Instead, he let the situation become more and more out of control until finally it was all but inevitable that the southern states would leave the Union and civil war would ensue. The really messed up thing is that he repeatedly claimed history would remember him fondly as a president who did the duty given to him by the Constitution. Unfortunately for Buchanan, history remembers him as one of the worst presidents of all time. And speaking of the Confederacy, there was one American who may have been the worst of all the rest during the Civil War. Nathan Bedford Forrest is number 16 on our list because of the heinous war crimes he committed during the Civil War. In April of 1864, an entire garrison of black Union soldiers surrendered to Forrest's troops. But rather than take the soldiers prisoner, he ordered them killed even after they'd laid down their weapons. And this was not just an execution, it was a slaughter, as Forrest ordered every soldier in the garrison to be killed. It should come as no surprise that Forrest was also one of the founders of the KKK and may have been the organization's first Grand Wizard. Either one of these atrocities is enough to make Forrest one of the worst Americans of all times, and together they put him high on the list. Men of the cloth are supposed to be loving and pious, but not Father Charlie Coughlin, who is the 15th worst person in America. He used his popular radio show in the 1930s to spew hate, fascism, and anti-Semitism across the country. He's considered to be one of America's first mass propagandists, and he did not have a nice message to spread. Basically, Coughlin was the first person to use the airwaves to spread radical, unfounded messages of hate. Unfortunately, he would not be the last person to do this, and the practice persists even to this day. Most of the worst people in America tend to be men, but not all. Some American women can be just as bad. Number 14 on our list of the worst people in America is Belle Gunness, also known as Hell's Belle. She was one of the worst female serial killers to ever live in the US. Her body count may have been as high as 40 people between 1884 and 1908. Belle lived in Chicago, where she killed 2 of her husbands and all 7 of her children. She collected the insurance money on her victims' lives to live a life of luxury. Belle was also reported to have lured suitors to her farmhouse, where she would drug and kill them. When things started to go south for Belle Gunness, she faked her own death by killing her maid and last 3 children. Then she burnt down her house with all the bodies inside. When the investigators looked into the fire, they found that smoldering remains of the adult body were too small to be Belle. They also uncovered that she had withdrawn all of her money from the bank only days before. Belle Gunness was never found, but her atrocities most definitely make her one of the worst people in America. Number 13 is a lesser-known murderer in American history. Her name was Clementine Barnabette. She lived in Louisiana, where she may have murdered as many as 35 people around 1910. But it's not the amount of people that got her on this list, it's how she killed them and why. Barnabette was a member of the Church of Sacrifice. When arrested, she stated that the priestess of the church had given her conjuring bags, which would make her undetectable to the police if she committed a crime. Barnabette claimed that her first murder was just to see if the voodoo magic worked, and then all subsequent murders were the will of the church. It was reported that several of Barnabette's victims were chopped to death by an axe, making Barnabette one of the earliest axe murderers in American history. What this next American did is so messed up and unbelievable that even the Nazis kept tab on his work. Number 12 on our list is Charles Davenport. Davenport was an American proponent of eugenics. This alone makes him a bad person, but what he did to others in the name of science makes him one of the worst people in America. His goal was to create an American master race of Nordic and Anglo-Saxon Protestants. He advocated for immigration restrictions of undesirable ethnic groups. Davenport was also a vocal proponent for sterilization of certain groups and forbidding marriages between races. He also contributed to the unknown sterilization of between 40,000 and 70,000 people during this time. Most of these people were poor, uneducated, and of non-white populations. This was a dark part of American history not often talked about. Davenport and his colleagues literally sterilized tens of thousands of Americans. At the end of World War II, German leaders cited America's eugenic sterilization laws in defense of their own actions at the Nuremberg War Crimes tribunals. Think about how messed up that is for a second. Number 11 on the list of worst people in America also exploited pseudoscience and bad practices for his own means. Both animals and humans were definitely harmed by this next American. At the turn of the 20th century, John Brinkley made millions of dollars through implanting goat testicles in men to help restore their virility. I think it's pretty obvious why he's on the list of worst people in America. Eventually, the American Medical Association sued him for libel, and his practice quickly collapsed as he went bankrupt. He did this procedure to hundreds of men, 42 of which we know died from infections after the procedure. None of the men had increased potency because of the goat testicles now attached to their body. We're now moving forward in American history, and you may be surprised how much worse things get. The worst people in America are actually more recent than you thought. The 10th worst American on our list is Samuel Little. Little was one of the most deadly, if not the deadliest, serial killer in American history. He claimed to have killed as many as 93 victims between 1970 and 2012. Although not all of these murders were actually connected to Little, the FBI did launch an investigation to see how many innocent lives were taken by the serial killer. They confirmed that Little killed at least 50 people, and that it was likely his total body count was closer to 90. Most of his victims were strangled to death, so the last thing they ever saw was the crazed look in Samuel Little's eyes as they slowly lost consciousness. Ted Bundy's a name you probably heard, and it should come as no surprise that he is number 9 on the list. Bundy was often identified as charismatic and good-looking, which is an odd description for someone as terrible as this serial killer. He kidnapped, abused, and murdered numerous women. He confessed to killing 30 women, but the worst part is that many of the lives could have been saved. Bundy was arrested and incarcerated multiple times, but he escaped from prison not once, but twice. He murdered multiple victims in the same day and is even reported to have abducted multiple women from the exact same location only hours apart. He was eventually executed by electric chair, but we may never know the full extent of the carnage left behind by this terrible American. If you're afraid of clowns, number 8 on our list of worst people in America is probably the reason why. John Wayne Gacy murdered a minimum of 33 young men in the 70s. This should be enough to make him one of the worst Americans of all time, but this gruesome murderer took things to nightmarish levels. He's known as the Killer Clown. That was because he performed shows as a character named Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown at different children's hospitals and charity events. He would abduct young men from these functions and bring them back to his house near Chicago, where he would torture his victims before eventually using a garrote to strangle the boys to death. What's worse than a person committing their own atrocities? People who get others to do the bidding for them. And the next few people on our list are the worst of the worst. Number 7 on our list of worst people in America embodies this persona. Charles Manson gathered a group of about 100 followers who were called the Manson family. They carried out as many as 35 killings. One of the most brutal killings was in 1969 when the Manson family murdered a number of Hollywood elites at a dinner party. And although Manson was not directly involved in the massacre, he was charged with inciting the violence. He was convicted of first-degree murder for directing members of his cult to commit the crime. The family members claimed that they had killed in the name of Manson because the Hollywood industry had rejected their leader. Anyone who would brainwash over 100 people and then use them for his own deranged means is definitely one of the worst people in America. Number 5 and 6 is a tag team duo. They're both terrible people who did horrible things to others. Keith Raniere was the founder of a pyramid scheme turned cult called NXIVM. Think of it as a pay-as-you-go program. As you want to learn more about Raniere's philosophy and teachings, you have to pay more and more money. And if this wasn't bad enough, members were so invested that they started recruiting their own friends and family into the cult. It was literally a pyramid scheme. As the years progressed, more and more members, especially women, found themselves being exploited by Keith Raniere and his close associate Allison Mack. They would target anyone who even had the slightest interest in the organization, saying it would change their lives. They collected millions of dollars from their members, since each level in the organization required that they take courses offered by NXIVM to receive peace and understanding around their lives. Of course, all of this was just a way to make money, and no benefits came of the courses they offered. But this is where things would get really dark. There were special groups of women that Allison Mack would recruit from within the cult. This group of women would be literally branded with a hot poker, and the brand itself was unbelievable. The women were told it was a special symbol, but what the brand turned out to be were the initials of Keith Raniere and Allison Mack. Both Raniere and Mack were arrested in Mexico and extradited back to the US. Keith Raniere received 120 years in prison for racketeering, sex trafficking, and forced labor conspiracy. Allison Mack only received 3 years in prison for racketeering, even though other women have come forward and said that Allison Mack was the reason they got branded, and that she helped lure unsuspecting women into the clutches of Keith Raniere. Number 4 is a man who literally made up a religion to influence followers and hold power over them. This man was a sci-fi and fantasy author named L. Ron Hubbard. The religion he created is called Scientology. You've probably heard horror stories of people who were pretty much abducted into the Church of Scientology and had to escape. Hubbard didn't so much start a religion as a cult. Hubbard used made-up stories about aliens and what he called Dianetics as the foundation of his cult. He promised members that through his teachings they could remove the trauma from their mind and live a life of happiness. Obviously, there wasn't and still isn't any evidence that Scientology and its teachings can provide benefits to someone's life, but people paid massive amounts of money to join the organization, and once they were in, they were trapped. Hubbard completely made up the teachings of Scientology and accumulated massive amounts of money from its members. But the lasting effects of Scientology, the abuse of its members, and the lies about being able to help people are what makes L. Ron Hubbard one of the worst people in America. What these next few Americans did will shock and disgust you. The top 3 worst people in America were all into necrophilia. Earl Nelson makes our list not because of how many people he killed, but who his victims were and what he did to the bodies after they were dead. In the 1920s, Nelson was known as the Guerrilla Killer or the Dark Strangler for the murders he committed along the west coast of the United States. He would target middle-aged landladies, rent an apartment from them, and then brutally murder the women. He killed the women via strangulation and then used their bodies after death. Nelson was also connected to the killing of a 14-year-old girl who he not only killed but mutilated after she died. Number 2 on our list is Gary Ridgway. He's known as the Green River Killer. In the 1980s and 90s, he targeted sex workers from Seattle. He was convicted of 49 murders, but is suspected of killing over 90 women. Other than sex workers, Ridgway also targeted women in vulnerable circumstances and young females who were underage runaways. He would dump the bodies in secluded areas of King County, Washington, and was reported to go back to them to have sexual intercourse with the corpses. And we've now reached the end of our list. The worst person in America goes to Jeffrey Dahmer, who took being terrible to a whole new level. Dahmer was a serial killer who targeted mostly African-American men at gay bars and other public places. He lured them back to his house, where he offered them alcohol laced with drugs that would knock them out. After the victims were subdued, he would strangle them to death. Once his victims were dead, Dahmer engaged in sexual acts with the corpses. If this wasn't bad enough, he would then dismember the bodies and dispose of the remains. However, perhaps the worst part was that Dahmer kept souvenirs of his victims like their skulls or genitalia. And if all that wasn't bad enough, Jeffrey Dahmer would take photos of the murder and mutilation process so he could remember and relive each heinous act after committing them. The body parts in his fridge and photos of his gruesome atrocities are clear evidence that Jeffrey Dahmer was the worst person in America. August 27, 1964, Grandma Kemper is sitting at the kitchen table editing the manuscript of her Boy Scouts book, Boy's Life. Her 15-year-old grandson Edmund walks up behind her and puts 2 bullets in her head. He then stabs her 3 times. He later explains to police why he did it and just wondered how it would feel to shoot Grandma. That's brutal. But in the great scheme of things, it was the least shocking of Edmund Kemper's crimes. To know the man, you have to know the child. Ed Kemper was one disturbed kid, but it's not surprising when you hear some details about his life. That day, when he shot his grandma, someone he loved dearly, he then stabbed her 3 times, and he said he had to make sure she was well and truly dead because he didn't want her to suffer. After that, he carried the body up to one of the rooms, and he waited for his grandpa to get home from grocery shopping duties. When he heard a car pull into the driveway, he greeted this man he also loved dearly. With shopping bags in his arms, Grandpa Kemper smiled widely and said, "Hey, buddy." Ed later told the police, "When he turned, I placed the rifle this far." He used his forefinger to demonstrate the distance from the back of his head and shot him. By the time Ed was 15, he was already messed up, although we think we didn't really need to tell you that. This kid, massive in height and build with a very high IQ, was not like other kids. He wouldn't be like other adults either. Unless it's not that unusual to sleep with the heads of the women you've killed. Kemper blamed his mother for that, for the most part at least. Clarnell Kemper wasn't easy to please. She'd grown up wanting only the best. She was intelligent and very ambitious in high school, expecting to marry the ideal American Prince Charming. She got what she wanted, too. After finishing school, she became president of the National Federation of Federal Employees. She stood at a great height, both figuratively and literally, but even the best wasn't good enough for her. That's when she met Ed's father, also called Edmund. He was a behemoth of a man standing 6 foot 8 inches. He wasn't a man to be messed with, his status as a Special Forces commando in the Army impressing the hard-to-please Clarnell. Then Ed Sr. went to war, fighting in the Devil's Brigade, an outfit known to take on the riskiest missions from which many soldiers did not come back. In one such mission, fighting against an elite German squadron, he was only one of 23% of his battalion to come back alive. When he got back to the U.S., to Clarnell, he was wounded both physically and mentally. He was a changed man, no longer the dashing soldier that Clarnell admired. He was downbeat and depressed, having discovered hell on earth in the war. She became disappointed in him, crestfallen that her hero was all too human. He later said that facing his nagging wife was more difficult than facing the German elite soldiers. The atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with her, he said, adding that she did more damage to him than 396 days and nights of fighting on the front did. You might wonder, why are we telling you all this? The answer is, this story can't be told without knowing something about Clarnell. Leaving her out would be like talking about a malignant tumor and not mentioning the cause of cancer. On December 18, 1948, their second child was born. His name was Edmund Emil Kemper III. He was the malignant tumor, the product of a cancerous relationship. He grew up with his mother after Kemper Sr. could not take it anymore and left the family home. Now young Ed became the sole focus of Clarnell's frustrations and failures, belittling him at every opportunity she got. Growing up, his mother used his sisters to bully and harass him. He was made to feel shame about himself, something from which his mom derived much enjoyment. For that, young Ed would sometimes cut off the head of his sister's dolls. As you know, he'd be preoccupied with the heads later in life. One time, his sister teased him about his crush on his teacher, to which Ed replied, "If I kissed her, I'd have to kill her first." Fearing her own son, Clarnell locked him in a basement in the dark, making him sleep there with the scurrying rats. As he got taller, she moved his bedroom down there for good, turning the key to the sounds of his sobbing. There, he fantasized about violence, once beheading the family cat on his return upstairs. He kept the skull in his closet. Meanwhile, Clarnell tried and failed to meet a man that lived up to her very high expectations. For all her woes, she blamed Ed, the product of the man that had left her. Ed cried for days on end, pleading with his ma to let him go live with his pop. His father eventually took possession of young Ed, although he quickly moved the teenager in with his parents, Edmund Sr. and Maud, where they lived on a farm. They adored the child, showering him with love and gifts. One of those gifts was a .22 rifle, which, unbeknownst to them at first, Ed used to kill just about every single animal in sight. When summer came, he was returned to his mother. He later went back to the farm a changed boy. He killed more animals with that rifle, after which his granddad confiscated it. You know what happened next. Ed was subsequently sent to a psychiatric institution. There, doctors remarked on Ed's friendly demeanor and high intelligence. He was called a sociopath, but a boy with outstanding qualities who could use those qualities for good in the right environment. All the time, Ed was well aware of how to manipulate the doctors that treated him. After all, his IQ was near genius level. At age 21, he was released and sent back into the heart of the furnace that founded him, aka his mother's house. Almost immediately, they had what he later called vicious battles. He got a job working for the California Highway Department and also got his own place. Still, his mother kept tabs on him, calling him nightly to complain. Ed called her a manipulating, controlling beast, echoing what his father had said. Something was about to blow. May 7, 1972, Ed, now 6 feet 9 inches tall, weighing in at 280 pounds, was driving his car down the freeway when he spotted two young women hitchhiking. They were Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa. He then picked them up, although somewhere on the journey they realized he wasn't going in the direction that he said he would go in. He then stopped the car at a quiet area and got into the back seat. There, this huge man put handcuffs on Pesci and took Lucchesa out to the trunk. He later remarked of sitting with Pesci in the back. "I was really quite struck by her personality and her looks, and there was just almost a reverence there. There was absolutely no contact with improper areas." He said what bothered him, though, was the fact that he might have accidentally brushed up against her breast. Embarrassed, he said to her, "Whoops, I'm sorry." This was a man that was about to kill her. Just after the apology, he put a bag over her head and stabbed her to death, slitting her throat at the end of the attack. He then went to the trunk and did pretty much the same to Lucchesa. But the act of killing wasn't what actually thrilled Ed. He wasn't a sadist, per se. What he wanted was complete control over his victims' bodies. The killing was just a necessary act for what he wanted to do later. He took the bodies back to his apartment, where he dissected them and beheaded them, later remarking how he heard a little pop when their heads came off. Again, he told detectives there was absolutely no contact with improper areas, although this was certainly a lie. Ed said he just sat there looking at their heads when at one point one of them fell off a chair and made a loud noise on impact with the floor. He later told the detectives, "The neighbor hates my guts. I'm always making loud noises at night. He gets a broom and whacks on the ceiling. Buddy, I say, I'm sorry for that. I dropped my head. Sorry. That helps bring me out of the depression." He also said that he had fallen in love with Pesci, or what remained of her. He went back to the grave where he buried part of her, talking to her like a boyfriend. He told detectives that he was well aware of his twisted psyche. He knew what he had done was demented, but it just felt right to him. He then said words that have gone down in history. "When I meet a pretty girl, one side of me says, I'd like to talk to her, date her. The other side of me says, I wonder what her head would look like on a stick. Just for you serial killer geeks out there, these words were once wrongly attributed to Ed Gein in the movie American Psycho. Ed told police he didn't have the confidence to actually meet a woman and start a relationship. Instead, he made dolls out of them. They were more manageable that way. It was only a matter of time before he made another doll. On September 14, 1972, he picked up another hitchhiker. She was named Aiko Ku. He killed her and then went for a beer at the local pub. Halfway through his beer, he couldn't resist going back to look at the victim in the trunk of his car. He said he admired his catch like a fisherman. He did with her what he'd done with his first two victims. He buried most of the body parts, but he saved her head. When he went to see a psychiatrist for one of his regular appointments, her head was in his car trunk. This is what the psychiatrist wrote in the report that day. If I were seeing this patient without having any history available or without getting the history from him, I'd think we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who has an initiative, intelligence, and who is free of any psychiatric illness. I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be a danger to himself or to any member of society. A second psychiatrist that day added his own thoughts. I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunction of his juvenile records. The doctor added that he was glad Ed had gotten rid of his motorcycle, something he said was the only threat to himself or anyone else. Ed's record was wiped on those recommendations. He then went back to live with his mom after getting injured at work. In January 1973, he picked up Cindy Shaw. He snuck her body into his mom's house and dissected it the next morning after draining it of blood in the bathtub. When he finally buried the head, he put it in the garden facing up to his mother's bedroom. He later said he did that because his mom always wanted people to look up to her. Now that a few young women had gone missing in the same area, police told students not to get in cars with strangers. They still did, though, and on occasions with Ed. One reason was the fact he sounded so articulate and with his spectacles looked quite academic. But also because, due to her work, his mother's car had a university car park sticker on it. In February, Ed killed two more women. They were Rosalind Thorpe and Allison Liu. He did the same with them, playing with his dolls when his mother was sleeping in the next room. Later, he explained to police why he was so fascinated with the heads of his victims. The head trip fantasies were a bit like a trophy. You know, the head is where everything's at, the brain, the eyes, mouth. That's the person. I remember being told as a kid you cut the head off and the body dies. The body is nothing after the head is cut off. Still, part of him knew he had to stop. Ed Kemper knew he was crazy. He understood the duplicity inside him. Maybe he thought one particular trophy might end my madness. April 20th, 1973, it was then that Ed finally decided to fight the demon he'd been fighting all his life, his mom. That night, she'd arrived home drunk as usual. Ed walked into her room as she was reading a book. He just stared at her, and she said in a belligerent manner, "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." He walked back out of the room. At 5:15 a.m., she was sound asleep in her bed. Ed walked in and hit her over the head with a hammer. He grabbed her moaning body and slit her throat. He stood there just looking at her, thinking how weak she was. He asked himself how this thing in front of him had managed to have such power over him his entire life. He cut off her head and put her larynx into the garbage disposal, taking much enjoyment from that part. He said he did this because of all the complaining she'd done throughout his life. But when he turned on the machine, the organ wouldn't quite go down. He later told detectives even when she was dead, she still wouldn't stop expletive at me. I couldn't get her to shut up. What remained of her head he placed on a shelf and screamed at it for an hour or so, intermittently using it as a dartboard. Ed then got on the phone and talked to his mother's closest friend, Sally Hollett. He told her he'd arranged a surprise party for his mom and could she come around the house. He killed her too, sleeping with her head in his mother's bed. It was at that moment that he realized something. There had been no need to kill anyone except his mother. He later recalled his decision to stop killing. The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. Emotionally, I couldn't handle it much longer. He drove to a call box many miles from home and phoned the police. He told cops he'd killed his mother and her friend, but they didn't believe him and told him to call back later. He then called back again, this time asking to talk to a cop that he knew. One of the reasons Ed had gotten away with his crimes is he used to drink with the police at a local bar. They'd tell him about their hunt for the killer. No one ever expected Ed, the amiable, clever fella, to be a killer. He later said in interviews that when his victims got in the car with him, they'd discuss the terrible maniac doing such terrible things. He'd think, man, how come they never suspect someone like me? It was this high IQ and obvious capacity to fool others that made Ed Kemper the focus of the FBI's new serial killer unit, which formed the basis of the Netflix series Mindhunter. He might have been a monster to the public, but for cops and criminologists and the media, he was an endless source of information. One time, when being interviewed back in the day by the FBI's famed mindhunter Robert Ressler, Ressler got anxious and pushed the button for the guard to come. Ed looked at him and said, I could screw your head off and place it on the table to greet the guard." By the time the guard arrived, Ed had said he was just kidding. Ressler later recounted, "My mind raced. I envisioned him reaching for me with his large arms, pinning me to a wall in a stranglehold, and then jerking my head around until my neck was broken. It wouldn't take long." Ed asked for the death penalty and to be executed prior to torture, but he didn't get his wish. He was imprisoned and later on a few occasions denied parole. He once said, "Society's not ready in any shape or form for me. I can't fault them for that." The last time he was denied parole was in 2017, and he won't get his next hearing until 2024. He'll be 76 years old. He's always been considered a model prisoner, but it's likely even as he approaches the twilight of his life, he'll remain behind bars. When we think of the most evil men in history, our minds might immediately flicker to figures like Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, just to name a couple. But what about figures farther back in time? In a past video, we discussed why Emperor Nero was the most evil man in human history. But as far as the Roman Empire is concerned, there's another man we can't forget. That is Emperor Caligula, the man who ruled before Nero and took Nero's inheritance money when he was so young. So was Caligula worse than Nero? Let's take a look. First and foremost, we should mention that a lot of Caligula's behavior and actions were considered most cruel and sickening. Even his own people at the time thought he went way too far. That's saying something for a culture that engaged in violent entertainment, watching gladiator fights to the death on a regular basis. Born in the year 12 AD, Caligula's real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, named after his famous relation Julius Caesar. This name, Caligula, stemmed from a Latin nickname translated as Little Boots, because his mother used to dress him up as a soldier when he was very young. When Caligula stepped into power in 37 AD, it was initially a time of celebration. It provided the people with hope for a golden age. You see, his predecessor Tiberius had been enormously unpopular, and the people suspected that he'd secretly ordered to have Caligula's father Germanicus poisoned to death. Tiberius had also had his mother and brothers forced into committing suicide. At any rate, Caligula was only thought to be spared due to his very young age at the time. What was it about the ancient Roman Empire and evil leaders? At any rate, when Caligula succeeded Tiberius, the people were glad to have a descendant of the beloved Germanicus take over. They thought Caligula would be a good, fair, and just ruler, but they were in for a big surprise. In his early years, there had been rumors that Caligula engaged in incestuous behaviors with his own sister Drusilla, because being orphans, they lacked love and companionship from others. This would later fuel Caligula's lustful reputation when he came into power. When Drusilla died at the age of 20, he was devastated and forced his people to engage in public grieving for 2 months. He'd later have a daughter, which he'd also named Drusilla in tribute to her. Now, if you think a romantic relation with your sister is gross, you should consider that Caligula was a man with an enormous sexual appetite. He was into some very disturbing acts, to say the least. Most were at the expense of others. Since this is a family channel, we'll try our best to keep the promiscuous details at bay. But one nasty and cruel act that he liked to do was to use other men's wives for his own amusement and pleasure. His power over others excited him, enticing him to abuse it whenever he had a chance. Further, he loved to embarrass and humiliate the husbands of the wives he toyed with by publicly criticizing their performances or techniques. Doing so made him feel more powerful, and he loved exercising his position by dominating his people. There were instances where he'd attend a wedding only to stop the marriage from happening so that he could have his way with the bride. He'd then ditch her soon after while telling her she couldn't marry. Some of his perverted pleasures may have been due to the influence of Tiberius. There had been a time when Tiberius had Caligula stay with him at his villa on the island of Capri. This was part of a sick game whereby Tiberius was basically forcing the 19-year-old Caligula to live alongside the man who had destroyed his family. It was here where Caligula would watch the gruesome scenes Tiberius played with, and we say this as to not be too graphic, underage boys and girls before having them tossed over a cliff to meet their demise. Oddly, Tiberius began to kinda like Caligula and allowed him to watch all the sick torturing, sexual exploits, and sadistic executions. So it was this environment that may have played a huge influence on the boy's mind. Tiberius himself was quoted as saying, "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people." Returning to the events of Caligula's reign, the emperor later fell in love with a woman named Milonia Caesonia in 39 AD, who was known for her extravagance and promiscuity. She'd already had 3 children from another man and was described as being neither beautiful nor young. She was a woman who loved to engage in self-pleasure. Still, he loved her passionately and ended up marrying her. Some thought that Caligula's madness was the result of a love potion administered him by Caesonia, since she was not the most popular choice in bride. Regardless, Caligula was so proud of his wife that he'd parade her naked in front of his troops and selected friends. In an ominous display of love, he'd tell her that he could have her throat slit whenever he pleased before proceeding to kiss her neck. He'd often jokingly threatened to have her tortured or executed as an odd way of flirting. This couldn't have been all that settling to Caesonia, who somehow put up with it. Aside from the sexual lewdness of Caligula's behavior and actions, he was also very cruel in his approach to torture and mass killings. He'd force families to watch executions of their children. To make this worse, he'd force the relatives of the victims to smile and cheer over the execution before themselves would also be executed. He also held parties and gatherings of a joyous nature to watch people be brutally killed, and invite their grieving loved ones to join in on the festivities, forced to act like they were having a good time. But Caligula didn't just have people executed in the way you might think, quick and to the point. No, that would be too easy. Instead, he ordered executions to happen slowly. He wanted victims to feel their pain. He liked the killings to start with a bunch of cuts and abrasions while steadily progressing to increasingly worse methods of torture, keeping victims alive to experience it as long as possible. It was disturbingly fun for him. On one occasion, his victim shouted to proclaim his innocence before being tortured, in which case Caligula then called him back, not to pardon him, but to have the man's tongue cut off so he couldn't shout his innocence again. The poor man was then thrown back in with the wolves to proceed with the harsh, tortured execution. He was a man with a sadistic serial killer mentality, arguably worse than the likes of Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. And he had absolute power. How terrifying! Though Caligula only reigned over the Roman Empire for slightly less than 4 years, his time and power was so impactful that his name continues to live on in infamy 2,000 years later. It's difficult to think of the name Caligula without thinking of cruelty and perversion. From seducing his sister, parading his wife naked, and making his horse a state official, yeah, you heard that last part right, Caligula was also a madman. He believed himself to be a living god. Most emperors were considered gods after death, but Caligula didn't want to wait for death to be declared one. He considered himself above other people, a divine figure. He claimed to seek direct advice from the god Jupiter. He also claimed to party regularly with Hercules. He even incorporated a holy temple into his palace. The executive director for the American Institute for Roman Culture explained that by doing this, Caligula was basically making a statement saying, "I'm living with the gods, I am a god." He was, in essence, the ultimate maniacal narcissist. He also had statues of himself built in every temple in the empire. Since Caligula was still young at only 28 years old, people were worried that this tyranny would continue for many more years to come. Conspiracy among the people grew against him. Thus, in 41 AD, the emperor was proven once and for all that he was not a god, but rather a mere mortal like everyone else. This happened when a group of his guardsmen attacked him after a sporting event. The assassination took place in Palatine Hill, Rome, Italy. He was left with 30 stab wounds. His body was then dumped into a shallow grave. Sadly, his wife and daughter Drusilla were also murdered. His statues were taken down in an attempt to purge the terrible memory of Caligula. They did a good job because Caligula was indeed almost wiped from history. The reason we still remember him today is because his behavior and actions were so hard to forget despite the efforts to do so. His memory was also preserved by some for the sake to serve as a later warning for the people that anyone could become a monster. Though they'd killed Caligula, however, they weren't ready to kill the system. The Senate had an opportunity to seize power and change everything, but instead, they placed Caligula's uncle Claudius in charge. The failure to end the emperor system would later result in another Caligula-type leader with the infamous Emperor Nero. Fictional evil leaders have been a mainstay of movies, novels, and TV shows, but when it comes to the deeds of real-life leaders, fiction is often no competition for fact. For example, during his reign as leader of the Mongol hordes, it's been speculated that Genghis Khan killed as much as 11% of the world's population. Tamerlane the Great, also known as Timur, would actually build towers out of skulls. And Qin Shi Huang, on his way to becoming the first unified Chinese empire, destroyed every semblance of an education system by burning books and burying scholars alive. But what about the famous Roman Empire? Were there any bad ones? The answer is simply yes. And the one that first comes to mind is Nero, Emperor Nero, a leader who ancient writers and historians claim not only started the Great Fire that destroyed Rome in AD 64, but also fiddled as he watched his city burn to the ground. With this thought in mind, we're going to look at why Emperor Nero is the evil leader in human history. Or was he? Nero was born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on December 15, 37 AD. When he was only 2, his father Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus died of edema and left a huge chunk of his estate to his son. However, the inheritance was taken from him by the Emperor Caligula. Eventually, Nero took the name we all know and love to hate when he reached the tender age of 13. It was at that time that he was adopted by his mother, Agrippina the Younger, and great-uncle the Emperor Claudius, who by that time had succeeded Caligula following his assassination by his guards. Nero's mother Agrippina was described as vicious, violent, and unforgiving. I guess in this case you could say like mother, like son. Agrippina even had her second husband killed. Eventually Nero would take the reins as emperor at the age of 17 after his great-uncle died unexpectedly. Some historical sources from the time claim that people saw Nero's mother feed her husband poisoned mushrooms, resulting in his sudden death. Despite our perception of Nero today as an evil and hated ruler, during the time of his reign he did in fact hold a strong amount of support from the Roman Empire. He was young, new, and loved music and the arts, traits the general public admired in their leader. Occasionally he was even claimed to be kind. The Roman Empire's historian Suetonius wrote, "He let slip no opportunity for acts of generosity and mercy, or even displaying his affability." After only 2 years of his reign, though, that affability seems to have disappeared, and Nero ordered that his mother be killed. A gradual falling out between the two had begun some time prior, eventually leading Nero to removing her face from Roman coins. By that time, she had lost the respect of Nero's advisors as well. There's multiple contradicting and often fantastical reasons for why Nero ordered his mother killed, but the most common and often agreed upon is that she herself was actually plotting to kill Nero. So Nero said, "Off with her head," so to speak. Nero actually ordered an accidental collision of her boat, hoping she may perish with the sinking ships. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, she survived the initial attempt. Finally, he ordered assassins to kill her and make it resemble a suicide. This time, she did not survive. Nero was relieved to find that he was actually congratulated on the death of his mother. Many high-ranking officials surrounding him, along with some of the general public, suspected his life was in danger from her plans to kill him and saw it as a fortuitous event. On June 9, 53 AD, Nero married Claudia Octavia. Their marriage was not a pleasant one. Octavia was described by the Roman senator and historian Tacitus as an aristocratic and virtuous wife, meaning she had moral standards and wanted to honor her husband. Nero, on the other hand, was quite different. He was immediately bored and angered by his new wife's mindset, as it deviated strongly from what he wanted out of a wife. On occasion, a rage-filled and frustrated Nero would even attempt to strangle Octavia. But perhaps the biggest issue for Nero was that Octavia was unable to bear a child for him. With no child, there would be no heir to his throne. Eventually, Nero began having affairs with different women, one being a freedwoman named Poppaea Sabina. After she became pregnant with Nero's child, Nero decided to divorce his wife for Poppaea. Together, Nero and Poppaea banished Octavia from Nero's empire. However, Nero did not expect the backlash that came from his people. Many Roman citizens very much liked Octavia and protested severely the banishment of her from the empire. They carried statues of her through the city, and the protests were so large that Nero briefly considered remarrying her to calm the people. Nero feared that the only reason the Romans saw him as their leader was his association with Octavia and her connection to past royal families. So after much deliberation, Nero did the next best thing to remarrying his estranged wife. He had her killed. He hoped that this would instill some fear and prove his strong leadership to the people. Octavia was put to death in a traditional Roman suicide ritual on June 8, 62 AD. Only 2 years later, Rome burned. The now infamous incident began on the evening of July 18, 64 AD. The fire ignited on the Aventine Hill, one of the 7 slopes that Rome is built on overlooking the Circus Maximus. The fire burned for nearly 6 days before it could be somewhat controlled, only to reignite once again and burn uncontrolled for another 3 days. Over a total of nearly 9 days, 2/3 of Rome had burned to the ground. Just about 70% of the city was completely destroyed. Homes, temples, markets, all burned to the ground. Nero at the time was not himself actually in Rome. He was at his villa in Antium, which was about 35 miles away from Rome, though he rushed back immediately upon hearing the news. Once back in Rome, Nero immediately opened his palace doors for the now homeless people of Rome and offered shelter and food. He was quick in his desire to begin rebuilding the city, and conveniently a new palace for himself, called the Domus Aurea, which in Latin means golden house. It was a massive palace complex that would eventually take up nearly 1/3 of Rome. The construction of the new palace is what led to many Roman citizens speculating that Nero had ordered the Great Fire of Rome himself, a devious plan that would allow him to clear the land to build the palace of his dreams, while also allowing him to spin his public image by being the charitable ruler who opened his doors to his people when they needed help. Although he got the palace he wanted, his image was irrevocably tarnished and the rumors spread quickly and escalated. It was at this time that Nero's decline truly began. The rebuilding costs of Rome were high and forced him to devalue the imperial currency by 10%. Revolts in the Roman provinces of Judea and Britain were also escalating. Nero suspected that there were high-level conspiracies originating in the Senate to have him assassinated, which he decided he could only prevent by having them killed first. With unrest growing in Rome, Nero took an extended 15-month trip to Greece. There, his passion for art grew and he gave himself to music, sports, and theatrical performances. When he finally did return back to Rome in 68 AD, he found even more unrest in the city. He had grown more distant from military decisions and completely failed to respond to an urgent revolt in Gaul, as well as growing tensions in Africa and Spain. Finally, at their wits' end, the Senate made a bold move and announced that Nero was an enemy of the people. Soon, everything Nero had done as emperor seemed to finally come to a head, and his world began closing in on him. Many people believed it was him that started the Great Fire of Rome, and he had killed his mother, his first wife, and now new rumors popped up that he had killed his second wife too. Nero attempted to flee the city that by now had completely turned on him. Learning that his arrest and execution were imminent, Nero decided to fall back on his favorite move, killing. This time though, he took his own life on June 9, 68 AD. He was 30 years old. Immediately following Nero's death, the Roman Empire went through one of its most tumultuous periods. It was pure and total chaos, with multiple emperors taking control and getting killed before they could even do anything. It became known as the Year of Four Emperors. Tacitus described it as a period rich in disasters, even in peace full of horrors. If someone kills their own mother, their first wife, possibly their second and pregnant wife, and maybe even burn down an entire city that they were ruling, you may look at them in a bad light too. It is true that Nero did some pretty bad things, but as time has moved far away from these events and historians have continued to study the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and even more specifically the rise and fall of Nero, many have found that he may have been more misunderstood than downright evil. And maybe, just maybe, history should have painted him in a different light. Let's first start with the famous image of Nero fiddling as Rome burned. First of all, the year was 64 AD, and the viol family of instruments, which includes fiddles, was not even invented until sometime around the 11th century. So there's zero chance that he could have been fiddling at the time. Second, as we talked about earlier, Nero wasn't even in Rome when it began burning. He was 35 miles away in his villa. Is it possible that Nero did order the burning of Rome even though he wasn't there, and most likely not playing an instrument when it happened? Yes, that's possible, but there's still no concrete evidence to date to support it, and it seems more likely that the whole story is folklore created after the events took place. But what about the terrible acts he committed as a ruler? The murders, the scheming, and plots? Again, some of them probably yes, but as more and more historical data is uncovered, we're finding that Nero was actually liked by many of his people at the time. It's clear that he was always more interested in the arts than actually governing, and certainly less interested in dealing with the military. Because of this, he did not have the advantage of military victories and the fame, success, and adoration that came along with being a military hero that many other emperors and leaders of Rome have had, which probably meant that many elite Romans in the Senate hated Nero, while the citizens celebrated his devotion to local issues. Historian Rebecca Benefiel said, if it had been up to him, he probably wouldn't have chosen to be emperor at all. We have to remember that he was adopted into this position and ultimately groomed to become an emperor. Given the choice, he may have chosen the life of an actor or a musician rather than be the leader of the world's largest empire. This is even reinforced by his dying words as he took his own life. "Oh, what an artist dies with me." Ultimately, Nero's reign was a confusing one with all sorts of ups and downs, and judging it is rather hard. He most certainly earned his reputation as a paranoid, murderous ruler. Also probably deserves some revaluation by historians to see really what happened while he was in power. Was Nero the hated, violent, and power-hungry leader we were told? Or was his a misunderstood, misplaced, and art-loving leader that the common people loved? Only further study and time will tell on this one. If you're not already hardened to prison life, no doubt those first few days locked up are going to be a daunting experience. Any number of prisoners who've turned over a new leaf and talked about their experience on the inside will tell you it's probably better when you get to prison to keep your head down. In certain places of the US, prisoners have talked about how they first had to show their papers, meaning the document that explains what crime or crimes someone has committed. Other ex-convicts have talked about how you might have to join a gang, even if you don't want to. While you'll hear a lot of toughened former prisoners saying if you don't want to get bullied, then stand up for yourself. You might lose the fight, but at least someone will think twice about bullying you in the future. That said, there are some extremely violent and unhinged people in the prison system. If you get on the wrong side of these people, it's just plain bad luck. You might not even have to do anything wrong. Someone could be so unstable the infraction you committed is in their mind only. They might simply be crazy. Imagine the nightmare of sharing a cell with someone who's done some horrible things to people and he's not exactly friendly toward you. You fear what might happen when you fall asleep, if you say the wrong word, if you breach one of the rules he's laid down for what he calls his cell. And then there's the prison yard. In a recent interview, one former prisoner and leading gang member said the yard can be a tricky place to navigate. His advice was don't go out there looking too happy or too sad. Don't be too animated, he said, because there are likely a lot of people who will read something into that animation. Have you suddenly come into money? Do you have illegal substances? Are you laughing at them? Talking about them? He added that when he was in California, some guys on the yard might be wired and paranoid because they've been binging on illegal substances. He advised people to keep a blank expression, but his primary advice was just stay out of prison because it generally is a terrible place to be. The numbers differ, but it's stated by various human rights groups that the number of mentally ill people in U.S. prisons is disproportionate to the number of mentally unwell people on the outside. The Treatment for Advocacy Center wrote in 2016 that in the USA, 20% of people in jails and 15% of people in state prisons had a serious mental illness. Go back a few years and the Human Rights Watch said that 1 in 6 prisoners were mentally ill. That same article said many of them suffer from serious illnesses, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. That's not to say, though, that these are the people who tend to hurt others. Far from it. Human Rights Watch wrote that mentally ill people can be victimized and exploited by others, and they are often punished by staff for making a lot of noise or not following orders, and even hurting themselves. Because of that, these mentally ill people might be isolated from others, and this could really push them over the edge. Being left locked down and isolated could lead to acute psychosis or a depression whose depths are unfathomable. That report took 2 years to write and involved interviews with hundreds of inmates, prison staff, mental health workers, and attorneys. And while it's a bit dated now, the neglect of mentally ill prisoners is still discussed today and is still a big issue. The report told us that around 70,000 inmates in the U.S. prisons are psychotic every single day. This doesn't mean that these people are dangerous and violent. As we said, they might just be a danger to themselves. But as Human Rights Watch says, some prisoners do have extreme and uncontrollable mood swings, or sometimes they hallucinate or experience troubling delusions. Some of these people might do things like paint their cell with their own natural waste. They might beat their head against a wall, or worse, attempt to finish their own existence. They're often moved, sometimes because they've committed violence against others because of their delusions. As we said, paranoia can be fomented in the yard after prisoners have done too much time alone with an illegal substance that might have prevented them from sleeping. Some prisoners have been known to be perpetually unstable, too quick to lash out, and you can find many instances when prisoners have asked for a cell change because they fear for their life. Of course, not all psychotic people are violent, and not all violent prisoners have a mental illness. But if your cellie is constantly obsessed about how you're plotting against him when you are not, it's a problem. It's also a problem when you share a cell with someone who is so explosive and unpredictable that he causes you great harm for the smallest of transgressions, such as you snored or left some food crumbs on the floor. Such people exist, and no prisoners want to share a cell with someone like that. We should now give you some examples of when mentally ill people did some horrible things while in general population. One prisoner that made the headlines all over the world should very likely not have been in the general population. This is a British man still in prison today, but isolated because of things he did while locked up with other prisoners. His name is Robert Maudsley, and he has somewhat sensationally been nicknamed the real Hannibal the Cannibal by the British tabloid press. He's also the longest-serving British prisoner right now. Reports state that as a child he had suffered terrible traumas and he had tried to take his own life a number of times. He claimed to hear voices telling him to kill people, and then he did commit one murder which landed him in prison. Given his background, you might think he needed psychiatric care, and perhaps the authorities might have thought hard about how he might get along with other prisoners. He actually did get some psychiatric care as he was first sent to the mental health facility, Broadmoor Hospital. There, he and another prisoner captured a man and held him in a cell, and proceeded to torture that man to death. That year was 1977. But believe it or not, it was then decided to send Maudsley to a normal prison. He wasn't happy about this transfer and made it well known. And around a year later, other prisoners would pay for this bad move by the authorities. One afternoon in '78, Maudsley invited a fellow prisoner into his cell. He then proceeded to garrote the man and stab him to death. After that, he hid the body under his bed. Subsequently, he invited other prisoners into his cell, but they declined the invitation for a chat. Maudsley didn't stop there and went out on the wing to find another victim. He found one. The second victim gained the killer some amount of notoriety as he was found dead with a spoon sticking out of his head and part of his brain missing. In spite of what the British tabloids wrote, it's thought he didn't actually eat the brain. After that, he was detained in a special glass cage cell, which looked a bit like the cell Hannibal Lecter was locked in the film Silence of the Lambs. He will stay in isolation until he dies, and has had requests to kill himself or even have a pet bird denied. The Guardian wrote in 2003 that he has a genius-level IQ, loves poetry and art, has a university degree, and enjoys classical music. Other prisoners have talked about the day he killed the two men, saying they saw madness in his eyes and they believed he wanted 7 victims in total. The jury is still out as if this man should have ever been among other prisoners. Some of his victims had hurt young people, and that's what he said happened to him as a child. Because of this, some people will tell you that he should have had more treatment for those traumas and not been part of the general population. Maudsley's relatives have said the system has only ever wanted to break him. The man himself said this: "All I have to look forward to is further mental breakdown and possible suicide. In many ways, I think this is what the authorities hope for. It doesn't matter to them whether I'm mad or bad. They don't know the answer and they do not care, so long as I am kept out of sight and out of mind." Even if you think the prison system got it wrong here, it probably doesn't detract from the fact that you probably wouldn't want to bunk with this guy. These kinds of stories are not so uncommon either. In 2014, the Australian media reported that an inmate who was suffering from schizophrenia had murdered his cellmate. The press wrote that this man believed that other prisoners were actually aliens, and he killed one of those aliens by strangling him with a television cable. A psychiatrist that later talked to the prisoner said the man thought all the other inmates were trying to kill him. Apparently, he believed that people of different nationalities actually came from different planets. Because of this, he wasn't convicted of murder and was sent not to another prison but to a prison hospital. In 2019 in the USA, a man called Jamie Osuna did something even more gruesome, but he wasn't thought to be suffering from an acute mental illness. In interviews, he claimed to be a sadist, his face tattooed with a Joker-type smile and satanic symbols. He was locked up already for murder and in interviews called killing an addiction, a drug. Is he mentally unwell? You could say he is, but more in the way we might refer to someone as a psycho than someone who is a certified psychotic. You wouldn't want to be in the same cell as him, that's for sure. In 2019, the media reported that Osuna had killed and dismembered his cellmate in California. He then beheaded that man. A Kings County Assistant District Attorney said about the incident, "This is probably the most unusual and gruesome case that I've had in my career. It's highly unlikely that Osuna will get a cellmate again, and even 20 years down the line, you wouldn't want to be the person who shares a room with him. But unhinged people time and again have been given cellmates." The Guardian in the UK reported in 2006 that an extremely violent and openly very racist man was put into a cell with a man not of his race. The man was British Asian and just 18 when he was killed by his cellmate. He was only serving 90 days for a small offense, and it was the first time for him in prison. And worse, he only had to wait until the morning to be released. That didn't happen because his cellmate beat him to death with a table leg he had managed to take off. How could this happen? The prison officials knew this man was a racist, and other prisoners later said he was strange, weird, and aggressive. It's also written that he had displayed the behavior of someone mentally unwell, such as when he ate soap, painted the walls with his own product, or started a fire. As a teen, he had slashed his own wrists, stabbed a teacher, and then was put into care and later young offenders institutions. One officer at such an institution wrote on a report that he was a disaster waiting to happen, and a mental health care worker wrote he had a long-standing, deep-seated personality disorder. The Guardian writes that he was also involved in another murder at a young offenders institution, and cites a report that there was a real chance that prison guards, where the murder of the young Asian man happened, played a game called Gladiator. This, in the words of the newspaper, involved putting unsuitable inmates together in the same cell to generate violence. The judge in the case said prison officials should have known this young man with such violent tendencies could have been capable of such a thing. It became a huge case and a movie was later made about it. The term fragging, or the deliberate killing of your military colleagues, was coined during the Vietnam War. It was a shockingly common phenomenon during that conflict, but why? Why were American soldiers killing their own officers? What drove them to do it? How did they get away with it? And what impact did this unprecedented level of murderous insubordination have on how the military operates today? Before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the Vietnam War and how it all began. The Vietnam War lasted from 1955 to 1975, making it a 20-year-long hell for all involved on both sides. It was a divisive conflict, and to this day, many Americans question if the United States should have gotten involved. The main driving force for the United States invasion of Vietnam was the domino theory, the belief that if one country were to become communist, all of the neighboring countries would do the same. The U.S. feared communism would spread to South Vietnam and the rest of Asia. In an attempt to stop this from happening, the U.S. government sent supplies, funding, and military advisors to South Vietnam, involving the United States in what was, at the time, a civil war. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Viet Minh, a communist resistance army that fought against the Japanese and French occupation. Ho Chi Minh wanted to unite Vietnam under a communist government. The country had been under French colonial rule since the 19th century, and during World War II, the country had been invaded by Japan. When Japan was defeated in 1945, they withdrew from Vietnam, and this would be the first domino falling. If you'll pardon the metaphor, that would lead to the Vietnam War. Emperor Bao Dai was in control of the country until he abdicated in 1945 at Ho Chi Minh's urging, leaving the country in the hands of the Viet Minh. Bao Dai spent a year as supreme advisor to the Viet Minh until he left Vietnam for Hong Kong, but the French and Viet Minh continued to unsuccessfully ask him for political support. When a coalition of Vietnamese anti-communists formed a national union, they told Bao Dai they would support him, but only if he would seek independence for Vietnam. Bao Dai would align himself with them. In 1955, Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunchly anti-communist politician, became president of the government of the Republic of Vietnam. Both sides had the same goal of a united Vietnam, but drastically different ideas on what a unified Vietnam would look like politically. Ho Chi Minh and his supporters wished for a communist government, while Bao Dai and Ngo Dinh Diem looked for a government closer to what existed in Western countries. Diem's forces received training and equipment from the United States military and the CIA, and they would use this to punish Viet Minh sympathizers in the South. Diem would refer to them as the Viet Cong, meaning Vietnamese communists. He had 100,000 people arrested, of which many were tortured and executed. In the United States, America was equally divided on the war. The first substantial student protest occurred in October 1963. At the time, the United States had only sent American military advisors to Vietnam, but students across the United States were speaking out, and they were united under the belief that the Vietnam War was wrong. The protests grew in strength as the conflict escalated, and some of the protests turned violent. When American troops were sent to Vietnam, they were surrounded by death and cruelty. American soldiers had to go up against the Viet Cong, who relied on guerrilla methods. They set traps in the jungle and would ambush American soldiers. And crucially to what would follow, many of the American soldiers were also not there voluntarily, but brought over due to the ongoing draft. Out of 27 million eligible men, the United States drafted 2.2 million American men during the Vietnam War. Although only 25% of the military were draftees, it also spurred a lot of men into joining the military to avoid being drafted into it. There were a lot of people who did everything in their power to avoid the draft, including intentionally failing aptitude tests and fleeing to Canada. It's not surprising that resentment would build between soldiers and their superiors. Although the total is incomplete, from 1969 to 1972, there were around 900 cases of known or suspected fragging during the Vietnam War, which resulted in 99 deaths and an untold number of injuries. From 1970 to 1971, the incidence of fragging increased even as the United States was withdrawing from Vietnam. But by the end of the war, it's believed at least 450 officers and 600 United States soldiers had been killed by fragging, and 1,400 had died under mysterious circumstances. Fragging was not new, as similar incidents had occurred prior to the 1960s, but it became far more prevalent. It was a way for soldiers to discourage those in charge from being too enthusiastic for combat. As the Vietnam War grew more and more unpopular, the soldiers lost morale. They saw no reason to risk their lives for a losing war that many of them didn't even support. There were a lot of soldiers who were given a one-year tour of duty, and this meant there was less cohesion among units. For some, it was self-preservation, killing their officers to ensure they might get out of the Vietnam War alive. American soldiers were staring down the Viet Cong as the United States was making little progress in the war. At times, fragging was used in order to remove leaders that soldiers viewed as incompetent or a threat to their survival. Soldiers resented that unit leaders would risk their soldiers' lives for personal gain. Fragging had surprising consequences, such as opium addiction among American soldiers. In some units, soldiers used fragging in order to fight anti-drug policies, so officers would tolerate drug use and general insubordination among their soldiers due to a fear of fragging. Without any restrictions on narcotics, drugs became freely available to the already traumatized soldiers. There were incidents where unit leaders who were considered too strict would be given warnings from soldiers. When a unit leader would enforce discipline or regulations, sometimes they would find a frag grenade with a safety pin left in it and their name written on it in their bunk. Other times, soldiers might have discharged a smoke grenade under their bunk. These always had a loud and clear message, and unit leaders would back down due to the threat of fragging. If you're wondering if anyone was ever caught committing the offense, it wasn't many, and even fewer people were convicted of the crime. Lower-ranked GIs united to protect their fellow soldiers, and they helped make it difficult to identify the guilty party of the incidents. Of those who had been convicted, they were given incredibly light sentences. Some were sentenced only to 10 months in jail. There were some notable incidents. In 1969, after the assault on Hamburger Hill, there was an underground GI newspaper that had placed a $10,000 bounty on Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt's head. Honeycutt had ordered and led the attack at Hamburger Hill, and the bounty had led to several unsuccessful attempts on Honeycutt's life. Hamburger Hill was a 10-day battle where in a remote valley in South Vietnam, American troops fought for control of a 3,000-foot-tall hill. After days of a bloody and vicious battle, they were able to take the hill, but they would abandon it only days later. After they abandoned it, the North Vietnamese would return to reoccupy it. Many saw it as a senseless loss of lives, and the debate continues to this day. Anger over the loss of life most likely incentivized American soldiers to want Honeycutt dead. In 1970, in Vietnam's Quang Ngai province, 25-year-old Captain Scott Edward Schneider was the commander of United States Army Artillery Battery. At 1:40 a.m. on August 17th, he was killed when an American soldier threw a frag grenade into his quarters while he slept. He died instantly. Private David K. Laughlin would be charged with his murder. 19-year-old Laughlin was described as a druggie, known for using hashish, LSD, and meth. He was also known for consuming a 6-ounce bottle of obesitol on a daily basis. Obesitol was a drug that combined several amphetamine salts in order to treat obesity. Laughlin would spend most of his time in a nearby village with a group of Marines. One of his platoon mates recalled that he would spend his time smoking opium with the old men. He was assigned menial chores, mostly due to his drug habit and absences, and he was prohibited from operating complex artillery. Schneider would eventually demote him from specialist to a private, or an E4 to an E1. They believed Laughlin's motive for the murder was a drug-induced grudge. Laughlin would plead guilty to unpremeditated murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. In 1979, Laughlin would be released after just 8 years and 7 months of his sentence. While drugs played a large part in fragging, racial tension was also considered a motivating factor in some cases. On March 15, 1971, at an Army base in Bien Hoa, Lieutenants Thomas A. Delvo and Richard E. Harlan, 2 white men, were killed by a grenade being thrown into their sleeping quarters. When Billy Dean Smith, a black private, was arrested for the crime, the prosecution argued that Smith had actually meant to target Captain Randall L. Rigby and First Sergeant Billy Willis due to their racist encounters with Smith. When Smith's case received international attention, it was moved from Vietnam to Fort Ord, California. The defense argued that the grenade pin had been planted in Smith's pocket after the attack. They alleged he had been targeted due to his anti-war statements prior to the murders. According to Black Scholar magazine, Smith was the logical guilty party because he was a black GI with a bad attitude. Billy Dean Smith was found not guilty. It wasn't unusual for the fragging incidents to miss their intended target. In 1969, a new commander was put in charge of Battery D of the 11th Marines at Phu Loc. Due to his style of discipline, he became unpopular with some of the Marines. On February 27th, someone threw a grenade into his sleeping quarters hoping to frag him, but he wasn't in his quarters that night. Instead, the explosion would kill First Sergeant Warren E. First, who was scheduled to return home to his family in just a few days. They never convicted anyone of his murder. At the Quang Tri Combat Base on April 21, 1969, someone threw a grenade into the company office of K Company, 9th Marines. First Lieutenant Robert R. Roweller would die as a result of the explosion. Private Reginald F. Smith would go on to brag to a colleague about the murder, which led to him being apprehended. As he told of his exploits, he still had the grenade ring on his finger. Smith would plead guilty to the murder, and he was sentenced to 40 years. He wouldn't finish his time, though. On July 25, 1982, he was murdered by a fellow inmate. Army captain and incoming commander of the 188th Military Police Company, Roy Moore, was strict. When he arrived near Da Nang, he would quickly discover that some of the MPs had developed addictions to drugs and alcohol. Moore comfortably filed disciplinary charges against addicted and insubordinate soldiers. Unsurprisingly, he received threats of fragging. One night, Moore was told that one of his soldiers, Kidwell, a known drug user, had shot First Sergeant Howard and planned to attack Moore next. Moore took precautions to defend himself against Kidwell, only to discover he'd already been taken into custody and was in his office. Kidwell was court-martialed and First Sergeant Howard survived the attack. The United States Army wasn't the only one contending with fragging. It was prevalent in the Australian military as well. Lieutenant Robert Thomas Convery of the 9th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment died on November 23, 1969 at the age of 22. After a night of heavy drinking with his battalion, a grenade was placed in his tent in Nui Dat around midnight. He was killed when the grenade exploded as he slept. He was due to return home in 5 days. Later on, Private Denzel Allen would be convicted of his murder and sentenced to a life sentence in Riston Prison, but he would only serve 10 years and 8 months. In one case, a booby trap may have saved a man's life. Eugene Linden was an American author who once wrote about the demoralization of American troops in Vietnam in a 1971 Saturday Review article. He told the story of a company commander in the 23rd Infantry Division. The captain was injured when he fell on a punji stick, a booby trap that's a simple spike made from sharpened bamboo. It turns out this was a life-saving event, as it removed him from combat. He was informed by a medic that all of the men in his unit were most likely pleased that he'd fallen on that stick. The medic explained to him that his unit felt he constantly put his men in danger and lacked common sense. The men had been talking about fragging him until he fell on that punji stick. Fragging statistics mostly cover incidents that involve explosives, typically grenades, but there are also several hundred murders by firearms. In those cases, it was typically men of equal rank shooting each other, though. According to the statistics on hand, less than 10 officers were killed by their colleagues via firearms. There were rumors of enlisted soldiers deliberately killing officers and non-commissioned officers using the chaos of the battlefield to get away with it. Another incident at Nui Dat involved Private Paul Raymond Faraday opening fire into the sergeant's mess of the Royal Australian Army Service Corps with his SLR rifle. On December 25, 1970, Faraday shot and killed Sergeants Alan Brian Moss and Wallace James Galvin and wounded Sergeant Frederick Edwin Bodle. He committed the crime after an all-day drinking session. Faraday was described as being paranoid and prone to fits of rage by an Army psychiatrist during his court-martial. Witnesses would state that Faraday was aware of his own actions, and they provided details of previous altercations with Faraday. Faraday would be convicted on 2 counts of manslaughter and 1 assault with a weapon. Of his 10-year sentence, Faraday only served 8. The United States military began to instill tougher restrictions on access to weapons to try to minimize the number of fraggings. They would instill post-fragging lockdowns until the investigation was completed. In May 1971, the United States Army had to temporarily stop issuing grenades to all units in Vietnam, and they confiscated weapons, ammunition, grenades, and knives. Despite their best efforts, this didn't reduce the amount of fragging incidents. If they couldn't get it from the American military, soldiers would find weapons through the black market in Vietnam. Fragging played a role in why the United States switched to an all-volunteer military, dropping the draft altogether. Nixon signed the legislation to end conscription on September 28, 1971, but it wouldn't go into effect until January 27, 1973. When Nixon ran for president in 1968, he had promised he would end the draft. Nixon also believed that ending the draft would put an end to protests. He thought that middle-class Americans would lose interest in the war if they didn't fear that they or their loved ones might be sent to fight. Despite running on that, Nixon wouldn't act on his promise for the first years of his presidency. In fact, a draft was originally due to expire in June 1971. Instead of allowing it to expire, Nixon asked Congress to approve a 2-year extension on it. They'd even compiled draft priority numbers for men born in 1954, 55, and 1956. Congress would not extend the draft, though. Vietnam led to a great deal of resentment from American soldiers. Many soldiers were also faced with Agent Orange, a mixture of herbicides that the United States used to clear foliage. It was meant to take away the Viet Cong's hiding places, but it's also believed that nearly 3 million American soldiers might have been exposed to Agent Orange. Many of these soldiers who were exposed later developed cancer or other medical problems, including Parkinson's disease. In 1979, United States veterans were able to bring a class action lawsuit against the 7 herbicide manufacturers who produced Agent Orange. They would settle out of court in 1984, creating a $180 million fund to compensate 250,000 victims and their families. It's also believed that exposure to Agent Orange is responsible for abnormally high amounts of miscarriages, skin disease, cancers, birth defects, and congenital malformations among Vietnamese people in the 1970s. American soldiers not only witnessed brutality, they participated in it as well. On March 16, 1968, the United States committed one of its darkest atrocities during the Vietnam War in the village of My Lai. The village of 700 civilians was invaded by the Charlie Company, 11th Brigade American Division, and they slaughtered 504 Vietnamese innocents, including children, within 3 hours. There were no reports of opposing fire from the village, but Lieutenant William Cawley, the commander of the unit, ordered his troops to enter the village firing. Civilians were clubbed, stabbed, and women were assaulted. The soldiers mutilated some of their victims by carving C Company on their chests. Only one American was injured during the massacre when he accidentally shot himself in the foot while he was clearing his pistol. Robert Maples, one of the soldiers at My Lai, refused to open fire at the Vietnamese civilians in a ditch. His commanding officer trained his own weapon on him, and Maples still refused. Meanwhile, helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson Jr. threatened to open fire on his fellow Americans, desperate to protect the Vietnamese villagers from being massacred. He threatened to report the massacre as well. He had blocked the American soldiers with his helicopter, and he had his crew aim their guns at the American troops and rescued villagers hiding in a bunker. When Thompson noticed movement in one of the ditches, he landed so the crew chief, Glenn Andreotta, could rescue a young boy from the ditch. The boy was covered in blood but uninjured. Thompson would report the incident to his army officers, but while that did lead to a ceasefire, it also led to a cover-up. The United States military would work diligently to keep what happened in My Lai a secret. L. Mendel Rivers, the chairman of the House of Armed Services Committee, would later claim that Thompson was the only guilty party there that day since he was the one who had turned his gun on his fellow Americans. It's no surprise that Thompson would throw away the Distinguished Flying Cross that they'd awarded him for saving the lives of the Vietnamese villagers. When given the medal, the citation made no mention that the hostile fire he faced was from the American side. Thompson believed the United States military wanted to buy his silence. He would receive the Soldier's Medal in 1998, but he refused to accept unless they gave the award to his door gunner, Lawrence Colburn, and the late Andreotta. Sadly, Glenn Andreotta had died in a crash 3 weeks after My Lai. The United States military couldn't keep the lid on My Lai forever, especially after Ron Rittenauer, a 22-year-old gunner in another unit, wrote letters to 30 congressional and military officials a year later. Someone connected to the military called a part-time political columnist from the Village Voice to tell them about a United States soldier being court-martialed for the massacre at the Vietnamese village, but the army didn't want anyone reporting on it. Naturally, the columnist, Jeffrey Cohen, was interested. He called a freelancer named Seymour M. Hirsch and told him about the story, and it was Hirsch who would dig deeper into what had happened. Hirsch would fly out to Salt Lake City to meet with Cawley's lawyer, and he would travel to Fort Benning, walking around the base until he found Cawley to interview him. Hirsch would uncover the story for the American public, later winning the 1970 Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. When the public learned about the My Lai massacre, anti-war sentiments rose further. The investigation into the massacre uncovered widespread failures in leadership, discipline, and morale. The United States military had lost many career soldiers over the course of the ongoing war. If they hadn't been rotated out or retired, they were killed. They'd been replaced with draftees who lacked experience. Military officials blamed the disappointing talent pool for the military deteriorating. They argued that if they had more educated middle-class draftees, someone like Calley, an unemployed college dropout, would have never been the leader of a unit. Although he had dropped out of college, in 1967, Calley had managed to graduate from Officers Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. Calley would testify that he was ordered by Captain Ernest Medina to carry out the slaughter in My Lai. However, all the photographic and recorded evidence pointed to Calley alone. Calley was sentenced to life in prison, but he was released in 1974. He was given a dishonorable discharge and entered the insurance business afterward. The Vietnam War was in hindsight a travesty for all involved, with flaws that cost countless thousands their lives trickling down from the very top of leadership. Fragging is just one more shade of red amidst the overall atmosphere of tragic, bloody chaos. They came, they saw, they slaughtered. and as they decimated the planet of around 11% of its entire population, as many as 40 to 60 million people in Eurasia, they engaged in absolutely brutal warfare. "This is what you get when you mess with us," was the message they left in their wake, walking away from mountains of skulls, from great piles of hacked-up bodies, where sometimes even the household pets were impaled. The Mongols weren't just unstoppable, they left the scariest calling cards in military history. Today we're going to focus on the greatest of all Mongolian warrior rulers, Genghis Khan, the man who brought together and unified the nomadic tribes of Mongolia. With him at the helm, the Mongol Empire became one of the greatest continental empires in history. Under Genghis Khan and his offspring, the Mongol tribes would embark on military campaigns that conquered lands far and wide, covering today's Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, Poland, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, China, and Korea, going as far as Southeast Asia, Persia, Syria, Turkey, and India, and making a right bloody mess of Iraq. Genghis Khan was a brilliant military leader, but his resume certainly tells us there was much more to this man than brute force. He developed trading systems and communication systems, and despite the total lack of mercy he showed toward his enemies, he was somewhat tolerant of those who lived under him where their culture and religion were concerned. Nevertheless, the Khan strategy for conquering much of the planet included what you might call the specter of fear. If bells began to ring in your town and people started whispering that the Mongols were coming, you feared the worst. You'd heard the talk. They didn't just conquer, they annihilated. The Mongols didn't take many prisoners, but at least they usually issued a warning. Submit to us or face our wrath. Take the knee and pay tribute, or we will unleash a hell on you that you couldn't have even anticipated in your worst nightmares. If war can be avoided, good. If not, so be it. We've warned you. That's us paraphrasing, but as you'll see now, it's what happened. The Pearls of the Orient. We'll start with one of the Mongols' lesser-known stories, a kind of subplot to the larger Mongol conquests. It's the story of the city of Termez in southern Uzbekistan. It was the summer of 1220. Two of Khan's generals, the ultra-formidable fighters and strategists Subutai and Jebe, were busy in Persia. Genghis Khan was resting his soldiers and animals somewhere in the mountains to the south of Samarkand, Uzbekistan. That autumn, he moved south with his army toward the city of Termez. As usual, the people of Termez had been given the option to surrender. They decided not to do that, with historians now saying they were mighty proud of their city's fortifications. Like so many other foes of the Mongols, they mistakenly believed they could fend off a siege. They managed to hold off the Khan and his soldiers for 2 days, after which the city was overrun. Genghis Khan ordered his soldiers to get hold of every man, woman, and child. They were told to count the citizens and send them out into an open field. Every soldier was then given the number of people he had to slaughter. This was a small city compared to some of the other cities we'll talk about today. Nonetheless, slaughter is slaughter. As they got to the end of the massacre and the groans and screams were fading, a woman was seen running away. She was soon caught, but before they killed her like the rest, she presented a bargain. She told them she had swallowed a large pearl and they could have it if they spared her. Instead, they disemboweled her on the spot, and lo and behold, she hadn't been lying about the pearl. In fact, she'd swallowed a whole bunch of pearls, which got the Khan thinking. There were pearls in this city, and other people might have had the same idea as this woman. So he ordered his soldiers to disembowel every last person and go through their insides looking for pearls or other jewels. Now let's dig a little bit deeper. Excuse the pun. The Battle of Kalka River. Many of you will have heard of the Ukrainian region of Donetsk Oblast because of the recent fighting that's happened there with Russia. But long before Vladimir Putin was sending soldiers there, the Mongols were doing damage on a much bigger scale, led by the generals we just mentioned, Jebe and Subutai. Both these men were campaign masters, having already led conquests all over Central Asia by the time they got to Ukraine. On this occasion, they were going up against a strong coalition of Rus principalities. The Rus were a people spanning part of Eastern Europe, originally Norsemen, who were woven into the historical fabric of what is today Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. In this particular battle, it looked for a while as though the Rus armies were winning. They chased the Mongol hordes away. The Mongols, who were exceptional military strategists, were only retreating as part of a larger plan, spreading out their men and so spreading out the chasing armies. They stopped and got into battle formation at the Kalka River. It was the Cumans who got there first. These were nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia. Alone against the Mongols, they were beaten with ease. Historians can't agree on how many men died. Neither do they agree on who had the larger army, but it seemed that the Rus outnumbered the Mongols, which was often the case. The Mongols were just better soldiers, faster and more skilled. while their generals were smart and usually had spies. We'll talk more about that soon. This Rus coalition was eventually defeated, but not before some of the princes of the Rus told the Mongols that they'd pull back their soldiers if they were guaranteed safety. The Mongols agreed, but they also lied. They soon took all the princes and leading nobles to be executed. But as the Mongols had a rule about not shedding the blood of nobles, they proceeded to execute these men in a unique and savage fashion. They erected a kind of scaffold and placed large pieces of wood on it. They then set up tables and chairs for a victory party. Only below the wood, propping it up, were the nobles. When the Mongols celebrated eating, drinking, and dancing, the nobles were slowly crushed to death below. This was supposedly a respectful death, but oh boy, it sounds slow and agonizing. In terms of victims, it was also a small-scale event for the Mongols. The deletion of the Khwarezmian Empire. A large land empire in history you might not have heard of was the Khwarezmian Empire, which covered much of present-day Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Iran. This was a powerful empire and one that really got on the wrong side of what turned out to be the more powerful Genghis Khan. In 1219, the Mongols went after the fortified town of Otrar in present-day Kazakhstan. The governor of Otrar, known as Inalchuk, was particularly disliked by Khan. Around a year earlier, the Mongolian caravan consisting of around 450 people plus a diplomat sent by the Khan had been massacred in Otrar. The Mongol caravan had brought with him gold and other luxury goods to exchange for the empire's famous Khwarezmian fabrics. Inalchuk murdered them all down to the last person. No one's really sure why he did this. Some historians say he thought that there were spies in the caravan, which, knowing the Mongols, there probably were. Maybe Inalchuk just wanted these Mongolian valuables, although that would be strange, as his city was a major trading hub on the Silk Road, and caravans passed through it all the time. Massacring traders was not good for business. Whatever the reason of the massacre, a camel driver survived and got word back to Khan. The Mongol leader was furious. Even so, at first he sent 2 Mongol diplomats and a Muslim diplomat to Khwarezmian Sultan Muhammad II, with the message explaining that he wanted Inalchuk to be punished. The Sultan was evidently not afraid of Khan. He subsequently had the Muslim diplomat beheaded, and he cut off the beard of the 2 other men, which was seen as very dis. This act had been known as one of the most consequential disses in world history. What happened next might be one of the biggest overreactions in history, but let's remember, this was more about the balance of power than the death of a few men. The Mongols under Genghis Khan soon besieged the city of Otrar, a siege that lasted 5 long months. It might have lasted much longer had a sub-commander for Otrar's army, a man named Koracha, not become a traitor and open the gates of the city. The Mongols piled in, slaughtering every single man, woman, and child. Koracha, who thought he was now on the good side of the Khan, went with his men to the Mongol side. They were all slaughtered too, with Genghis Khan saying you can never trust a traitor. As for Inalchuk, he barricaded himself in one of the city's inner citadels, where he was surrounded by the last of his army. He managed to keep the Mongols back for a month, but in the end the fight was hopeless. All this time the Khan had told his men, "Do not kill him, bring him to me alive." Even when Inalchuk was on top of a roof resorting to throwing tiles at the Khan's men, they made sure not to kill him. Inalchuk was eventually captured. To say Genghis Khan was upset would be an understatement. So the story about him executing Inalchuk by pouring molten silver in his mouth, eyes, and ears could well be true. Some historians doubt it, but that's what was written, and let's face it, Inalchuk was never going to get anything but a grisly death. The Khwarezmians had picked a fight with the wrong man. They knew very well what the Mongols were capable of, and the Sultan knew that killing the Khan's men meant war would follow. It's likely he knew a war was coming regardless, which is maybe why he did what he did. Now Otrar was out of the way, Genghis Khan proceeded to take out an entire empire. The Sultan was now on the run, occasionally listening to reports about how another of his great cities had fallen. The Khwarezmian Empire Part 2. Genghis Khan was intent on wiping this entire empire off the face of the earth, and we mean annihilating it to non-existence. The Mongols were known for their take-no-prisoner approach, but during the ensuing battles they did in fact sometimes take craftsmen and artisans and send them back to Mongolia as slaves. Genghis Khan also sometimes took young men and drafted them into his own armies. Such massive territorial expansion would have been hard without picking up more soldiers along the way. The Mongols captured the city of Bukhara, and then they marched to the capital city of Samarkand. Genghis Khan, something of a psyops expert, used his many spies to gain information about the infighting among the nobles of Samarkand. He then endeavored to start a fake news campaign, further creating more hostilities in the city. He wasn't just a good military strategist, he knew how to play the misinformation game. The strategy of divide and conquer was never far away from Genghis Khan's mind. But as you'll soon see, he made sure the same could not be done to him by ensuring his army would always be loyal to him. When he knew the city was weak, Genghis Khan, along with his sons, Changhatai and Ogedei, and about 10,000 men attacked. Here, the Khan made good use of some of the prisoners he'd already captured, moving forward with them as human shields. Not only do human bodies act as protection, but Genghis Khan understood very well how firing into your own men dampens the enemy's morale. To further douse the broken spirits of the enemy, he had his men catapult the heads of the captured enemy over the wall. But at one point, the Mongols retreated after what looked like a devastating counterattack. Yet again, the retreat was just a ruse to split the opposing army. The Mongols soon turned back, killing most of the opposition soldiers. In the citadel, the last of the city's nobles hid, surrounded by their top soldiers. As he would do time and again, Genghis Khan offered to spare everyone if they surrendered. "Come out," he said, "and you'll be all right," he said. "If you surrender, I'll spare you, and I'll spare the inhabitants of the city," he said. There was something like 100,000 citizens in the city, although again, historians will debate the actual numbers. Regardless, they surrendered to the Khan on the promise of safety. He then had every last soldier cut to shreds. As was normal, he got his own soldiers to round up the men, women, and children of the town and attempt to estimate the numbers. He then gave each soldier a quota he had to slaughter, and that was that. The next few hours consisted of massacring thousands and thousands of innocent people. This was, of course, quite unbelievably savage, but that was the point. This was psychological warfare. When other cities heard about this, surely they'd submit to the Mongols and pay tribute rather than fight back. As you'll see, this was not often the case. We should also talk about how the Mongols, often outnumbered, were so successful. They conscripted males as young as 14 and as old as 60. Each man received part of the bounty distributed by a kind of governing body called the Jarku. This meant that said soldiers would all take a slice of what they found: slaves, horses, cattle, textiles, precious metals, and food. If you served, there were many rewards. If you disobeyed orders or fell asleep on watch, the punishment was severe. Maybe lashes, maybe death. If you ran away or deserted, you'd be caught and put to death. But yes, there were significant rewards, which was great motivation for the soldiers. The Mongols were famed for being able to ride a horse and fire arrows quickly at greater distances than their enemies. They used wooden saddles with high fronts and backs, which enabled them to sit securely and take a shot. When they had whole populations of towns rounded up, as they did in the cities we've discussed, they used spears, axes, long knives, or curved swords 30 to 50 inches long to cut down the populations. Did the soldiers sometimes feel bad about the industrialized killing? It's hard to say, but since they were rewarded, and since their leaders had often given a city a chance to surrender first, maybe not. And anyway, the Mongols didn't invent mass killing, they were just good at it. As is always the case in war, Genghis Khan used propaganda to get his men to hate their enemy. Did Britain and the US feel bad about bombing Dresden? Not so much at the time. People criticized the US when it was discovered that it had secretly bombed the hell out of Laos and Cambodia, but a good few Americans believed their nation was liberating the world from those damned commies. It's well known that Genghis Khan and the Mongols were excellent purveyors of propaganda, whether serving to spread fear among the enemies or get their own troops fired up. The Siege of Urgench. The savagery continued when the Mongols besieged the city of Urgench, also part of the mass destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. Genghis Khan's eldest son, Jochi, hit the city from the north, and his sons Chagatai and Ogedei came from the south. The invasion was made all the more difficult due to the area around the city being marshland. Moreover, there was a lack of large stones to catapult into the city. It's worth noting here that there was sibling rivalry between the brothers. Their dad was no spring chicken at this point, and he had to choose one of the sons to take his place. It was Ogedei who came out on top in this siege, and so was chosen to replace his father, but this would create a family feud. The siege of Urgench was one of the hardest for the Mongols when destroying the Khwarezmians, but with their catapults, their huge siege bows that could fire 20-foot arrows, and their battering rams, they eventually broke through. The Mongols also had gunpowder, something they'd discovered when invading China. To give you an idea of a typical arsenal for a Mongol siege, a historian wrote it consisted of 3,000 machines flinging heavy incendiary arrows, 300 catapults, 700 mangonels to discharge pots filled with naphtha, 4,000 storming ladders, and 2,500 sacks of earth for filling up moats. Naphtha, in case you didn't know, is a highly flammable liquid. Under this kind of attack, Urgench finally fell. A Persian scholar named Juvayni later wrote that 50,000 Mongol soldiers were each given the job of executing 24 Urgench citizens. That would mean executing 1.2 million people, which you can imagine would have taken a very long time. Giovanni was no doubt exaggerating, but modern historians don't disagree that the sacking of Urgench was one of the bloodiest massacres in world history. Again, the Mongols took artisans and other useful people, but the vast majority of regular citizens were executed on the spot. It's worth noting that prior to the systematic slaughter of the empire, Genghis Khan had written to the Sultan saying, "I am a master of the lands of the rising sun, while you rule those of the setting sun. Let us conclude a firm treaty of friendship and peace." As you know, the Sultan wasn't buying it, and as you'll soon see, perhaps he had good reason not to trust the Mongols. Massacre at Merv. The Mongols didn't always keep their word. When Genghis Khan's son Tului went up against the city of Merv, the battle was a difficult one. On the 7th or maybe 8th day, the governor of the city sent a message to Tului saying he'd surrender if the Mongols agreed to let his citizens live. Tului said he'd agree, and on the next day, when the city was handed over, he proceeded to massacre pretty much every single person within the walls. The scene was worse in the city that fell next. Nightmare at Nishapur. As we said earlier, there was some exaggeration at times in the past when it came to the number of kills. For instance, it was written that the Mongols executed 1.748 million people in a single hour when they sieged Nishapur. This couldn't have been true, but that didn't mean the Mongols didn't murder almost the entire population of the city. The siege only lasted 3 days. But in that time, Tokuchar, a son-in-law of Genghis, was killed in action. This infuriated Tului, who ordered every last man, woman, and child to be executed. He asked that Tokuchar's widow watch over this bloody spectacle. Tului even told his soldiers to murder every single animal in town, including the cats and dogs. But seriously, that many executions in 1 hour would mean 29,133 lives per minute, which frankly was just impossible. There weren't even that many people to kill, far from it, but you can bet it was no exaggeration that the Mongols did slaughter most or all of the people in the city. The history books also tell us that Genghis Khan's widowed stepdaughter was afraid some people might have only been injured, so she asked for each person to be beheaded. She was granted her wish, and the heads and the skulls of each person were stacked in pyramids, something that was said to have taken a whole 10 days. We can't be sure exactly how many people were killed when the Mongols rubbed out the Khwarezmian Empire, but that is certainly what they did. So it's possible that 10 to 15 million Khwarezmians were slaughtered in all. That's incredible and horrifying all at the same time, given the tools they had at their disposal. The Mongols never did get their hands on the Sultan. He was still on the run when he passed away. Historians have said he could have died of shock as he watched an entire empire crumble before his eyes. The sacking of Kiev. You'll remember that the Mongols went westward at the Battle of the Kalka River. They returned to this region in 1240 when they sacked Kiev. They burned the entire city to the ground, and it's believed that they only spared about 2,000 people from the population of around 50,000. This was under Genghis's grandson, Butu Khan, son of Jochi. Genghis had died in 1227. An Italian diplomat named Giovanni da Pian del Carpine visited Kiev in 1246. What he wrote in his diary is one of the best descriptions of the devastation the Mongols caused. He wrote, "When we were journeying through that land, we came across countless skulls and bones of dead men lying about on the ground. Kiev had been a very large and thickly populated town, but now it was reduced to almost nothing, for there are at the present time scarce 200 houses here, and the inhabitants are kept in complete servitude." China. The Mongol armies were spread far and wide. Although with the kind of postal system they'd invented, they were able to stay in touch. This is one reason how they managed to become so formidable. The conquests in China went on for over 70 years, from 1205 to 1279, during which time the Mongols conquered various dynasties and kingdoms. Again, they engaged in what's called annihilative warfare, meaning they massacred most of the inhabitants of the cities they plundered and burned to the ground. The Mongols created their own dynasty in China under Kublai Khan and his Yuan dynasty. This would collapse and be replaced by the Ming dynasty, which would rule China from 1368 to 1644. The Hongwu Emperor, the founder of the Ming dynasty, executed thousands upon thousands of people he believed were plotting against him. This often consisted of slow slicing and flaying. He even ordered that any man found to have his hair in the typical Mongol style, the partially shaved style with bits of hair hanging out, be castrated. You can understand his fear. It's thought the Mongols killed around 30 million Chinese people over those 70-odd years from a population of around 120 million. It all started under Genghis, a man and his army who the Chinese didn't think had a chance of breaking through the country's fortifications, notably the Great Wall of China. Beating China was by no means easy, but Genghis knew it could be done, once writing, "I had trained my men to attack with the speed of the wind. Now they had to learn the guile of the wolf." They went from city to city slaughtering everyone. As China was so divided, they employed Chinese armies and they employed Chinese weapons makers men who had great scientific knowledge, which is probably how those weapons advancements got to Europe. When they couldn't get past a wall, they waited, starving the people in the city. The Mongol armies were well prepared for long campaigns. They set up camp outside cities, living in tents known as yurts. Each soldier was equipped with tools for cooking and sewing, a file to make arrowheads, and a leather food bag that could double as a flotation device. They had 2 bottles for water and other liquids, and each had a cooking pot. Their entire life could be lived on the road. This is how they crossed great swaths of territory, often riding 60 to 75 miles a day. If the soldiers' dry ration ran out, such as their meat, they'd even drink blood from their horse's neck. While not as civilized as some of the nations they defeated, they usually had the upper hand in a fight. Iraq. In 1258, the Mongols laid siege to the city of Baghdad, where again they slaughtered almost everyone. Baghdad was an advanced city of the age. The Mongolians burned down its libraries, destroyed important books on science, medicine, history, and philosophy. A modern historian described the carnage in a way we think is representative of how the Mongols worked. They swept through the city like hungry falcons attacking a flight of doves, or like raging wolves attacking sheep, with loose reins and shameless faces, murdering and spreading terror. Beds and cushions made of gold and encrusted with jewels were cut to pieces with knives and torn to shreds. Those hiding behind the veils of the great harem were dragged through the streets and the alleys, each of them becoming a plaything, as the population died at the hands of the invaders. The Mongols also kept the promise of not spilling noble blood. It's said instead of cutting down the Baghdad Caliph al-Mustasim, they rolled him up into a rug and trampled him to death. The Mongols were military technicians, amazing on horseback, masters of spying and spreading disinformation, helped by their development of a postal system, and without a doubt they understood how important psychological warfare was. They were great at what they did, wholesale murder. Genghis Khan thought his destiny was to rule the earth, something he didn't manage, of course, but he sure made a good go of it. He once said, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have inflicted a punishment such as me upon you." From the queen who burned down an entire town using birds to the woman who became possibly the world's most prolific serial killer, today we have a show for you about the darkness that can eclipse a person's life once they're put into a position of power. Number 12. Let's start with a story of eye gouging, because every ancient tale of kings and queens should include someone getting their eyes torn out. This queen in question was Irene of Athens. She was born sometime around the year 750. We don't know too much about her early days, but we do know she came from a family that could greatly influence politics. That meant she was always destined to be involved in all that violent malarkey that came with politics back then. It seems as though she might have been an orphan who was adopted into this family, with the head of the family being a guy named Constantine Sarantapechos. He was either her uncle or cousin, but what's important is that he was a patrician, a part of the ruling class in the great city of Athens. Irene ended up getting hitched, the son of Byzantine ruler Emperor Constantine V. This son, Leo, might have picked her from a bride show. Irene was apparently easy on the eyes. In short, they had a son, and then when the emperor died, Leo became the new emperor. That made Irene the empress. So things were now looking fine and dandy for Irene, although things were never really fine in the Byzantine royal backrooms. That was where all the talk of skullduggery took place, and it's where people spread vicious rumors after Irene's Leo kicked the bucket. She was made a regent, and her son, now 9, was in a precarious position of being so young and there being so many people from the family thinking they should be the next emperor. This young boy might have been a kind of emperor, but a lot of powerful people didn't think that that was right. This was a tricky time for Irene, so she did what any queen would do and called in for some backup. That backup was mainly a bunch of Byzantine-era special forces called the Excubators. It seems she got busy banishing folks from the city of Constantinople, and she might have also had the whip brought out now and again for anyone thinking about making a fuss in the royal court. If you were loyal to Irene, you stayed. If you were not loyal, you were banished or whipped until you had a change of mind. But it seems as a regent, she was quite power-hungry, loving to see her face on coins, which was normally a privilege reserved for the emperor. Let's remember here that being a female regent wasn't easy. There were just too many people who wanted you dead. Take, for instance, Empress Martina. Martina was the last woman to become regent prior to Irene, and guess what happened to her? After about 1 year in the big seat, she was accused of poisoning folks and being power-hungry. So they cut out her tongue. Her sons were then paraded in front of her and their noses were cut off. Her youngest sons were castrated, and then the lot of them were banished to a small island. Make no mistake, Irene knew all about that story. She ruled well, making just the right friendships, but her son started getting a little bit peeved with her as he turned into a man. This ended with an open rebellion, but Irene came out on top, and it seems she forgave her son at first. He tried to topple her again, and again he failed, this time running away to the provinces. But Irene's army caught up with him and dragged him back to the palace. He pleaded with his mother, but she was having none of it. She told her men to rip out his eyes, which they did, leaving the young man screaming on the floor. He might have actually not survived the ordeal. Losing your eyes or nose in those days was serious business, given that they had no skilled surgeons, as we do now, or medication for infections. So was Irene a brutal ruler? Well, let's be honest, she was almost always surrounded by potential enemies. We know that a mother watching on as her son's eyes are ripped out is what you might call a tad brutal. But back then, it wasn't all that strange. Irene was deposed after a while and sent to an island where she lived on for about 1 year and then died. She apparently became a wool spinner during that last year, which is quite a fall for a former queen. She was now probably in her mid to late 40s at the time of her death. Alright, now for someone downright crazy. And we mean that in the maniac sense of the word. Number 11. Maria Eleonora is such a wonderful sounding name, but Maria the monster also has a ring to it. Her story starts at the beginning of the 17th century, when the King of Sweden Gustavus Adolphus was looking for a wife. One day he'd become an accomplished military leader, but in his early 20s he did what his mother told him. He actually wanted to marry a woman named Ebba Brahe, but his mother wouldn't allow that. They still wrote to each other often, but it seems nothing really came of the relationship. Then the king got wind of a 17-year-old girl who many said was the most beautiful person around. This was Maria Eleonora. They eventually married, although it said Maria could have gotten married to any number of rich and powerful men, including the King of England. She was generally well liked by most people, although historians say she liked to party a bit too much. Her favorite pastime was watching shows which consisted of actors who had severe mental problems. She also loved shows where the actors had dwarfism. So in general, she liked mocking people who were, let's say, just a bit different from her. Then something went wrong. She had a miscarriage, and it seems this sent her over the edge. She walked around using foul language, screaming at anyone close by using the most obscene words. She also became paranoid and violent, which is never a good mix. She later had a child, and that kid died after about 1 year. Remember that the king needed a son too, but most of the time he was risking life and limb in battles. That could mean no male heir if he died while fighting, and this put a lot of pressure on Maria. Then they finally had a baby girl, although Maria was horrified at what she saw. The baby, to be named Christina, had certain genetic condition, which meant she was covered in hair. Having a baby that resembled Bigfoot seemed to have finally sent her fully over the edge. Her first words when the baby was handed to her were, "Instead of a son, I'm given a daughter, dark and ugly, with a great nose and black eyes. Take her from me. I will not have such a monster." She had good moments, but many bad ones. She got pregnant again with a bump in her stomach and had a boating accident. Then she shouted to her friends, "Jesus, I cannot feel my child." This became yet another miscarriage. She really wanted a baby boy, of course, but what she ended up with was a girl that she'd hated from day one. It's suspicious then that Christina kept having strange accidents throughout her young life, like falling down the stairs multiple times, which was probably her tumbling down after being pushed by her mom. So while her husband was away fighting wars, she was at home torturing her kid. On various occasions, Christina should have died in those accidents, so we're going to call that attempted murder. Then, when Christina was 7, her father died. Guess who Maria blamed for the death? She blamed the daughter she so much detested. For about 1 year, Maria forced Christina to stay in a dark room alone. There were candles, but Maria expressly told the servants that not one beam of light should enter that room. But here's the kicker. For a while, the dead body of the king was placed in an open casket on the bed, and Maria told Christina she had to sleep next to it. Yes, she had completely lost the plot, so much so that she had Christina taken away from her. She was the mother from hell, although we think she had some serious mental health issues. Alright, now for arguably the most hated queen of all time. Number 10. This is the story of Marie Antoinette. A beautiful and cruel queen is living the high life in France where countless people are starving to death. Life is so unfair and unequal that one of the greatest revolutions is about to happen, and it's going to lead to a lot of rich folks losing their heads. When we say that living standards were unequal, we're talking about the obscene wealth of people living in lavishly opulent 50-bedroom country houses and poor people who could not even afford a piece of bread each day. As a certain story goes, one day in 1789, a servant was brushing the queen's hair when someone came into the room and announced something along the lines of, "Your Majesty, the harvest has been a terrible one and people are dying from famine. There is no bread to eat." Marie replied, "Let them eat cake." She was so out of touch with reality that she really thought her people could eat all the expensive cakes. Historians tell us she never actually said that, or probably didn't. The story might have been told time and again just to show how selfish the nobility was. Marie spent money on unbelievable luxuries when the people of France could not eat, and she was taking money from public funds. It didn't help her case that she was also said to be a bit of a libertine. So when she appeared in the Place de Révolution on her execution day, you can bet that it was a huge celebration. She was without a doubt the most hated woman in France. At about 12:15 p.m., her head was placed on the block of a guillotine and whoosh, the queen was dead. Was she really all that brutal? Maybe not so much compared to the other women you'll hear about today, but let's be honest, to enjoy living in insane luxury while not caring about all the mass death from starvation going on around you isn't exactly a nice thing. Alright, let's now talk about one of history's most infamous serial killers. Number 9. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and while she was a countess and not a queen, her story is too outstanding to not include on this list. Records show that this woman was almost inhuman in regard to her utter sadism that she inflicted on people. For one, she seemed to have hated her servants, and she would torture and kill them over the smallest matters. She even had a special torture room built for her brutal daily activities. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, she used her power to lure peasants back to her abode. She preferred good-looking young women, whose blood she thought would help her retain her beauty in old age. She would sometimes tear at the woman with her teeth like a savage animal. But after hundreds of peasants had died, some people became suspicious, especially as it was getting harder to get rid of the dead bodies. Bathory got older and became convinced that drinking her victims' blood wasn't working. So she told her servants to go out, find her women and girls with noble blood. These were hard to come by, so her servants ended up dressing peasants in fine clothes and telling them they had to pretend to be noble. To cut a long story short, the authorities were finally pushed into starting an investigation, even if Bathory was supremely powerful. They ended up finding mutilated bodies around her massive house, including folks who'd obviously been chewed on by Bathory. As you can imagine, this became a great scandal. About 300 people came forward and explained just how sadistic Bathory was, and how one day they'd sent their children to see her and the child never came back. The servants who helped Bathory pick up the victims were all beheaded, but Bathory, being so rich, was just told she'd have to spend the rest of her life locked in a rather luxurious castle. We'll never know the exact number of her victims, but it could have been as many as 650. Let's now head over to Asia. Number 8. Wu Zetian was a Chinese woman who historians have from time to time called a tyrant ruler. Born on February 17, 624, for a time she took over what was known as the Tang Dynasty. She might have had some tyrannical leanings, but back in those days, getting blood on your hands was part and parcel of being a ruler. It must be said, though, that she lessened corruption and was behind some positive economic reforms. She was a good leader, in some respects. It was what she did to get power that you could call a little bit sketchy. For instance, when she was just starting out, she joined the harem of Emperor Gaozong. Once there, she went about killing the others in the harem to ensure that one day she would become the empress. Some historians have written that to stay in power, she was absolutely ruthless. She might have even have murdered 2 of her own children, although that's still up for debate. It should be said that this particular rumor surfaced long after she died. Then, after she had secured her position, she kept it by coming down hard on anyone that criticized her. Some of those that did were either sent to exile or executed. It seems this kind of thing went on all throughout her life, although, as we said, in those days, in general, could be brutal. Next up is another person who seems to have lost her mind. Number 7. Her name was Maria I, known for being the first queen of Portugal and often called Maria the Pious there. But in Brazil, a country where she was also the monarch, she got the name Maria the Mad. She was the eldest daughter of King Dom José. When he passed away in 1777, Maria took the throne. She had a husband who became the king, King Dom Pedro III. But it was her who was the lineal heir to the throne, and so she wielded all the power. It seems at the start she did a pretty good job, but something wasn't quite right in her mind, and she often suffered from debilitating bouts of melancholia. When those came on, she would often become delirious and then end up having to be carried home. Her husband died, and let's just say things didn't get much better for her after that. Like the Roman Emperor Caligula had once done after the death of his sister, Maria made sure everyone under her mourned for this great man. She made life miserable for normal people because of her own loss, not allowing regular festivities to take place. But she wasn't only a party pooper. It wasn't long until she couldn't rule at all and spent much of her time alone in her room. This was a place from where people would often hear wild screams. She was later taken to Brazil, but things didn't get any better there. She spent all of her time alone in bed, half mad, hence that's why Brazil called her Maria the Mad. She stayed like that until she died in 1816. So while Maria might not have been the most brutal woman on this list, she was certainly a terrible queen once her madness kicked in. This next queen was much, much worse. Number 6. Her name was Queen Ranavalona I, and she ruled Madagascar between 1828 and 1861. Once her husband had kicked the bucket, she took over, and she became known as an avid isolationist who spent much of her time keeping European colonists at bay, something which made European powers quite displeased. Many of the horror stories about this queen came from European explorers in the region, so we must take everything written about her with a slight pinch of salt. Still, we know for sure that she amassed a great army, but she didn't ensure that they were fed well. Its center forces died wholesale from general ill health, forced labor, and also starvation. If you were against her, she'd put you through what we now call a trial by ordeal, meaning she'd find out someone's innocence or guilt by making them endure some terrible sadistic torture. With so many of her soldiers dying and so many civilians also becoming ill and dying, the population of Madagascar pretty much halved. So that's certainly a black mark against her name. But she also came down hard on Christians, sometimes putting them through these trials of ordeals after accusing them of some kind of witchcraft. It was this widespread oppression of people that made some historians call her a tyrant ruler, although other academics have said some of her misdeeds were exaggerated. One of those misdeeds, which may or may not be true, was her starving her own mother to death. This next lady on the list wins for just being plain weird. Number 5. Her name was Juana la Loca, and she was the Queen of Castile from 1504 to 1516. It seems at the start of her reign she didn't do much ruling at all. She was confined for much of it as she was deemed unfit to rule, so without any real power we can't really blame her for any special brutalities. But it was because of her and her family arguing about who would rule that led the country to falling into disorder. This was really bad news for much of the poor population who died in famines or from the plague. It's thought half the people of Castile died during these horrific years. Things didn't get any better as she got older, and it's said she lost her mind thinking everyone was out to get her, including some nuns who were only trying to take care of her. She would barely eat, and she refused to wash or change her clothes. There is some chance she might have suffered from a severe mental condition such as schizophrenia, but there's also a chance that many of the people who contended with her for power say this about her so they could say she was not fit to rule. Some of the stories they told, which could have been true, included her going back again and again to her husband's dead coffin and asking for it to be opened. She would then stroke the dead body and kiss his very cold feet. There are also rumors that when she traveled, the coffin and its occupant went with her, asking for it to be placed under her bed. If you want to know what made her that crazy, just look at her mother. Number 4. That was Isabella I of Castile. She ruled Spain at the side of King Ferdinand II from 1451 through 1504, a period of time that saw the start of the notorious Spanish Inquisition. We cannot place all the blame on her for kicking off this ghastly time in history, but she played a really big part in it. Isabella was the one who created the formal mass expulsion decree, leading to the expulsion of Jews and Muslims as well as mass torture of whoever she thought threatened her position. That itself would be enough to label someone a little bit brutal. But it gets worse. Many of those people who weren't expelled had to face the music of the investigations, which we call the Inquisition. This often included being tortured, and the woman we just talked about, Juana, grew up watching her mother order such tortures. In fact, it's said that because Juana's faith didn't seem strong enough, sometimes Isabella would suspend her from ropes, and to cause excessive pain, she would add weights to her limbs. By all accounts, Juana was just as skeptical about faith, but for Isabella, that was about as bad as it gets for a child. We imagine this next monarch would have done something similar given the chance. Number 3. She was Princess Olga of Kiev, and she was a monarch in the 900s in what is present-day Ukraine. Her husband Igor of Kiev died in 945 at the hands of a tribe called the Drevlians. It's totally understandable that Olga would be a bit peeved about losing her husband, but it's the brutality of what she did next that really makes her stand out. The Drevlians told her that the best thing to do would be for her to marry one of their own. They sent many ambassadors to her with this proposition, and she had them all buried alive. She even bent down as they were struggling to breathe and said something along the lines of, "How's this for a reply?" Olga later had some of the higher-ranking Drevlians invited to a great party at her house, which was perceived as a sign of goodwill and forgiveness. It wasn't. She invited them into the bathhouse and then had the doors locked and ordered the place burned to the ground. Later, she and her men massacred thousands of Drevlians in one attack alone. The people that were left barricaded the city and a siege ensued. Months passed and the people inside were starving, but then Olga got the idea to send in birds with burning cloth attached to their feet. The birds did their job and landed on the wooden houses and burned them down. Anyone seen running from the town was executed on the spot. So, this was about as hardcore as it gets in the realms of revenge. Olga was a badass without a doubt. She also was about converting people to Christianity, and so she was later canonized as a saint of the Orthodox Church. The next lady was not quite so heroic. She was just as bad to the bone. Number 2. She was known as Fredegund and was the queen consort to King Chilperic I, who was part of a dynasty within the Frankish kingdom, which encompassed most of modern-day France and parts of Western Germany. Her rule stretched from 584 to 597, and according to the few historians that wrote about her, it was a bloody career she had. What was written creates a picture of a woman who at times could be one very mean, murderous sadist. As the story goes, she wasn't born into any kind of highly influential royal family, but the king took a special liking to her from a young age. He didn't marry her though, and instead married a woman named Galswintha. It seemed that Fredegund didn't much like this, and she either convinced the king that Galswintha needed to die, or she just went about killing her by herself. Whatever happened, Fredegund was partly behind Galswintha being strangled to death. Fredegund then began a decades-long conflict with Galswintha's sister Brunhilda. The latter married Sigebert I of Austrasia, and it seems that it was Fredegund who ordered his assassination. She also might have ordered the assassination of one of his sons, but that one didn't work out. There were other successful assassinations, though, of people who had gotten on the wrong side of Fredegund for various perceived transgressions. She even hated her own daughter, Rigunth, and that's because once the daughter grew up and became attractive, she told Fredegund that she should be part of the consort of the king instead of her mother. The Roman historian Gregory of Tours said this happened next. Fredegund waited for her opportunity, and under the pretense of magnanimity, took her to the treasure room and showed her the king's jewels in a large chest. Feigning fatigue, she exclaimed, "I am weary. Put thou in thy hand, and take out what thou mayest find." The mother thereupon forced down the lid on her neck and would have killed her had not the servants finally rushed to her aid. So yes, this was a brutal woman if there ever was one. Now let's talk about a woman with way more blood on her hands. Number 1. Her name was Mary I of England, and she ruled over England and Ireland from 1553 to 1558. There's a kind of giveaway as to her brutality with the name she acquired. That was Bloody Mary, but this had nothing to do with a spicy cocktail that people often drink. During Mary's short reign, she went to great lengths to reverse England's split with the Catholic Church. This was known as the English Reformation and was started by that well-known killer of wives, King Henry VIII. It's a long and complicated story, but all you need to know is that once she rose to power, she went about releasing some of the main Catholics in England that had been previously imprisoned. It was now payback time, and there was a hell of a lot of reformers that Mary took aim at. She's known for something called the Marian persecutions, which in short meant going after Protestants. Some went into exile, while others were captured, tortured, and burned at the stake. This didn't just include high-level clergy, but a lot of normal folks too, which included women and children. During the torture, some of them might have been asked to renounce their faith, but in the end, as many as 300 folks were burned at the stake. About 30 people also just died in prison while waiting. Of course, there were many powerful players at the time, and we can't blame all the carnage on Mary alone, but it's a fact that all those people died in horrific circumstances under her rule. She did at least once say, "None may be burnt without some of the council's presence and good sermons at the same." You'd be right to think that a lot of scared people wanted to overthrow this bloody queen, which at times ended with rebellions. One of them was called the Wyatt Rebellion and involved a lot of powerful people in England. These people had not wanted Mary to marry Philip of Spain, but it's likely they just wanted to get rid of her in general. Mary might not have done the torturing herself, but what happened to some of those rebels before their execution was terrible. In order to spill the beans about other rebels, some of them had to live through horrific torture methods such as being stretched on the rack. Once they'd talked or not talked, most were burnt at the stake, with the unfortunate ones being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This consisted of hanging them while making sure they didn't die. Their guts would then be ripped out and their bodies chopped into quarters. The head was usually saved and stuck on a pike someplace to remind people of what happens when you start thinking about rebelling. Some historians put the number of deaths in this rebellion at 200, although a more conservative estimate is 100. When people were burned en masse, historians write that the air would be full of the smell of burning flesh. That was about to happen on November 17, 1558, when a bunch of Protestants were lined up. As they were preparing themselves to be burned, suddenly everything went quiet. That's because someone stopped the process and handed in a letter saying the Queen is dead. British law made it that now these people couldn't legally be executed. So was Mary any worse than other European leaders that executed scores of folks back then simply because of their faith? Maybe not. Her half-sister, Elizabeth I, would also execute people for the same reason once she was sitting on the throne. Still, in the carnage that happened during this period of time in that part of the world, it's the name Bloody Mary that seems to stand out the most. When you picture iconic rebels of Scottish folklore, you probably picture William Wallace, as seen in Braveheart, charging into crowds of English troops with his blue face paint and broadsword. What you probably don't picture is a psychopathic, mass-murdering cannibal with a bloodthirsty family that's said to have killed upwards of 1,000 victims. We're talking about Alexander Sawney Bean, the Scottish king of cannibalism, and his terrifying brood, the Sawney Bean Cannibal Clan. If you're about to eat, put down the fork and listen in. It's gonna get gross. When exactly Sonny Bean and his family operated, if they ever existed at all, is an open question. Some sources have him being born as early as the late 12th century, while others place him as late as the 15th or 16th century. The mythic nature of the Bean cannibal clan gives it a certain flexibility with the facts. Like many other disturbing folkloric figures, America has Mothman, England has Spring-Heeled Jack, and Scotland has Sonny Bean, who is undeniably the most gruesome of the national boogeymen. But according to most versions of the legend, Bean was born in the Scottish Council of East Lothian sometime before or during the reign of King James VI of Scotland. These were humble beginnings, as he was born into the poor homestead of a farm laborer. Not much is known about his birth family or childhood, but young Sonny is said to have done manual work like his father when he came of age, digging ditches and trimming hedges. However, things took a turn for the worst when this upstart young gentleman found love. Bean's crush, known as Black Agnes Douglas, was a woman of such low moral fiber that many thought her to be a witch. The two were a match made in hell. Sonny and Black Agnes eloped together, leaving the family and polite society for good. They robbed, fought, and even murdered for fun, like a brutal Scottish Bonnie and Clyde. This nightmare couple became so feared and scorned that they were forced to live off the grid to avoid being killed by angry mobs or the soldiers tasked with keeping the peace. Where did Sonny and Black Agnes decide to make their new home? If you guessed a dark, slimy sea cave, then ding ding ding, you are correct. The legends say that the two of them settled down across the country in Benin Cave in Ballantrae in Ayrshire. This cave wasn't just a glorified crack in the cliff face either. Benin Cave was a huge rock formation embedded with a complex series of mile-deep tunnels. The cave mouth would also be flooded twice a day at high tide, protecting the secret entrance from any outside intrusion. It was the perfect place to have an evil lair or to start a family. Or if you're Sonny Bean and Black Agnes, both. Sonny and Agnes got busy in every sense of the phrase, and soon enough, they had 14 more mouths to feed. If you thought that becoming a father and a family man would set Sonny on the straight and narrow, you'd be horrifically wrong. After all, without a real job, Sonny needed to find some way to feed his family. This encouraged him to take his crime game up to the next level. He started to rob and murder even more regularly, and somewhere along the line, Sonny acquired a taste for human flesh. The human flesh diet was one he quickly got his family to take up too, setting in motion a chain of events that would make the Sonny Bean clan the most vicious family of killers in Scottish history. When his children became old enough to take up the family trade, which is to say murder, robbery, and cannibalism, they joined their mother and father in ambushing lonesome travelers on Scotland's backroads. The Bean clan would murder those unfortunate passers-by and steal their clothes, cash, and valuables. They would then brutally hack their bodies into quarters before carrying them back to the cave for salting, cooking, and eating. To the untrained eye, it would just seem like the victim simply fell off the face of the earth, not leaving a single trace. Nobody knew that they were keeping the Bean clan fed. This taboo precursor to the Atkins diet seemed to be working pretty well for the Bean family, because over their quarter-century reign of violence and terror, their numbers swelled massively. The family's 14 children bore Sonny and Black Agnes 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters, all the products of incest. The cave soon became home to 46 brutal, flesh-hungry savages of varying ages, unified in one purpose: killing, robbing, and eating anyone who dared to come near Benin Cave. With this new horde of loyal and hungry relatives, Sonny Bean upped his game yet again, organizing brutal attacks on whole groups of travelers. They would meticulously track and stalk their victims, waiting for the exact moment to strike. And when they finally did strike, it was like something out of a living nightmare. Picture this: you're a small trading convoy. It's perhaps you and some family members and a few business partners. You're transporting goods across the highlands to trade. Perhaps you've brought a weapon or two just as a precautionary measure. It'll be enough to frighten off one or two opportunistic bandits, surely. Then, as you're walking down a lonely country road, you hear an almost demonic screaming and howling echoing from all around you. You're so shocked by the sudden cacophony, you don't know what to do. You freeze as suddenly shapes come charging in all around you. They don't look like your average highwaymen. There's men, women, and children. They're filthy, bloodstained, crazed. Some wearing tattered fragments of stolen clothes and others completely naked, like the Celtic warriors they descended from. All of them are bearing knives, clubs, or fists, and they set upon you in a violent frenzy. Before you and your party can muster up any kind of defense or even a reaction beyond screaming and wide-eyed terror, it's too late. Your supplies are looted, and your dismembered corpses are being carried off to Benin Cave to be salted or pickled. According to the legends of the Bean clan, this exact horrifying scenario played out hundreds of times over the 25 years that the brutal cannibal clan was active. While they were typically extremely skilled at slaughtering whole groups of people without leaving any material evidence, occasionally some terrifying clues to what was truly going on would slip through the net. Leftovers from the Bean Clan's legendary cannibal feasts would sometimes wash out of the cave mouth and end up on Scotland's other shores. People who lived on the coasts would sometimes see cooked or eerily well-preserved limbs appear on the beaches, some covered in human-looking bite marks. The Sawney Bean Clan's activities were even affecting the local economy. When the body parts began to wash up with greater frequency, local authorities realized there must have been some prolific murderers on the loose. Local innkeepers were grilled by ye olde police in connection with the murders, seeing as they seemed like the most likely suspects, considering most of the recent disappearances had been travelers passing through. The pressure got so great that some local businesses even closed up shop for good, unable to cope with the severity of police scrutiny. Not that any of these leads ever led anywhere productive. Meanwhile, the Sawney Bean Clan continued to do what they do best: murder, robbery, and cannibalism. People were being falsely accused and executed for the Sawney Bean crimes, while these murderous Scots were getting away scot-free, pun intended. Villages near Benin Cave were becoming ghost towns as inns closed down and rumors spread that anyone who passed through the area was doomed to disappear and die a horrible death. And to be fair, could you really say this was inaccurate? The Sawney Bean Clan was impressively prolific, by some counts murdering more people than Gary Ridgway, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and the Zodiac Killer combined. They were setting murderous world records. Of course, when you have such an impressive winning streak, it's unsurprising that you'd eventually let it go to your head. And when you get cocky, you get sloppy. This is exactly what happened one fateful night toward the end of the Bean Clan's tenure. A man and his wife were riding home on horseback from a local fair and happened to unknowingly wander into one of the Bean Clan's favorite routes. The two of them were in high spirits, laughing, joking, gleeful from their time at the fair. If they knew what was about to happen, they probably would have savored those last few moments together for longer. The hungry, watchful eyes of the Bean Clan were staring at them from the darkness. Just as had happened so many times before, the Sawney Bean Clan emerged from the darkness, ready to slaughter the unsuspecting couple. However, for the first time, even though the Beans had the numbers on their side, they were in for a real battle. The husband, as it turned out, was an experienced fighter, packing a sword and a gun that he used to single-handedly fend off the cannibal horde. During the bloody exchange, the wife of the couple tragically fell from the back of the horse and was gorily dismembered by the Beans. Legend has it that they began tearing out her entrails and eating her alive. This, however, only galvanized the husband's Scottish fighting spirit, bringing out the William Wallace in him as he continued to valiantly fight the cannibal clan with his pistol and sword. While he probably couldn't have sustained combat for long, the noise of the brawl unfolding alerted 30 nearby villagers. They charged in with their own weapons, forcing the enraged Bean Clan to retreat off into the night. For the first time since the start of this 25-year-long nightmare, their cover had been blown. Survival wasn't enough for the husband. He'd seen these animals slaughter his beloved wife. He wanted justice. He wanted revenge. That's why, as the legend goes, he traveled all the way to Glasgow to request a personal audience with King James. Some sources report it being James IV. Others report it being James VI. Point is, it was definitely a king called James. Moving on. He told the king his tale of the cave-dwelling cannibals, and the king was so horrified that he pulled together a 400-man hunting party and set out for Benin Cave himself. The days of the Sawney Bean Clan were officially numbered. King James and his elite cannibal hunting squad charged into Benin Cave with a pack of ferocious hunting dogs, overwhelming the Beans with their sheer numerical force. The cave looked like a set from a grimy 1970s horror movie, filled to the brim with stolen items and half-eaten corpses. Meat was pickled in barrels, hanging from hooks, cooking over open fires. The sight was so horrifying that the Beans were immediately hauled out of the cave and dragged back into mainland Scotland, where they were executed without trial. The brutality of the enraged Scottish public almost rivaled that of the family itself. The men, women, and children of the Sawney Bean Clan were alternately dismembered and buried alive. Their reign of terror was finally over, once and for all. This brings the gruesome legend of Sawney Bean and his bloodthirsty family to a close. Was any of this grounded in truth? Well, probably not. There exists no real concrete evidence to prove that Sawney or any of his or his family's crimes ever really happened. The tales of his exploits were only committed to writing hundreds of years after they supposedly happened, leaning more into frightening folklore than fact. Some contemporary scholars, such as Dr. Louise Yeoman, also attributed the figure of Sawney Bean to anti-Scottish propaganda on behalf of the English monarchy. Even the nickname Sawney was popularly used at the time as shorthand for a stereotypical violent Scot. However, even though he was probably never real, Sonny Bean's cannibal clan has since reverberated through pop culture in a massive way. In Scotland, Sonny Bean has made Benin Cave a popular tourist attraction, allowing locals to profit off of legend. The story of Sonny Bean also inspired the brutal horror novel Off Season by Jack Ketchum and Wes Craven's horror cult classic The Hills Have Eyes, about an American family being stalked by mutant cannibals in the Nevada desert. Even though Sonny Bean and his clan were, thankfully, a product of fiction, the ripples of his dark legend have the power to make us feel just a little bit queasy even today. Did you know some of the most vile, sadistic, warped killers in history got away? Most of them you won't have even heard of. Some of them right now could be living in a town near you, watching you, stalking you. And if two hardworking former detectives are right, they're conspiring to plan your murder on the dark web. This is for real. You'll hear about this underground group of modern American killers in due course, but before we talk about the present, let's look at the past. The New York Ripper murders. Many serial killers enjoy being front-page news. They thirst for the attention, which, as you'll see throughout this video today, is very problematic for society as a whole. Perhaps no one has had more attention than Jack the Ripper, the unknown maniac that worked at a time when London was the center of the media world. His story has been told a quadrillion times, and it seems he might have inspired copycat killers. Between March and May of 1915, the Ripper came back to life, although he was now called the New York Ripper. He brutally killed two young folks in some East Side tenements of Manhattan. Only 27 years after Jack did his business in London, stories of the New York Ripper filled the American press, leading to angry mobs taking the law into their own hands. The Brooklyn Daily Times said there was a ghetto Ripper. People read that a lunatic was on the loose. This caused panic in every household in this mostly poor area. This new Ripper taunted police with letters signed Jack the Ripper, saying he would kill again at random. 100 cops were soon assigned to the case. What's shocking is the Ripper wrote letters to the mothers of the victims. In one letter he wrote, "Dear Mrs. Murray, I really feel sorry for you, but when the excitement cools off again some evening after dinner, I'm going out to kill again. You must understand that I must see blood and cut flesh." So Jack the Ripper, or someone like Jack the Ripper, chose New York City as his hunting ground. The press sold newspapers while the public lost its collective mind. Soon a news report stated "man mobbed as Ripper." It explained that a cop had to draw his gun to stop the mob from killing the man. Another story talked about a man who was seen hanging around outside Lafayette Street School. 100 students chased him down. It was a delirious time, full-on mass hysteria. For Italians, then mostly quite new to the city, it became a perilous time after a cashier who'd sold one of the victims some milk before she was killed said she'd seen a foreign-looking man who she said looked Italian. Some newspapers then discussed these new immigrants and their alleged strange customs. The New York Tribune wrote, "It's well known that among certain ignorant immigrants from the south of Europe, there is a superstitious belief that by sacrificing a little girl, they can be cured of certain complaints." This immediately put Italians' lives at risk from the mob, even though the story was based on nothing but an idle rumor. Alas, the New York Ripper was never found, and things eventually calmed down. The next killer deserves a place in the serial killer hall of infamy. If there was such a thing as the Ripper's Ripper, it would be this guy, the worst of the worst, the Cleveland Torso Murderer. The story of this very real Ripper takes place around the southeast side of Cleveland, Ohio, in an area that was known as Kingsbury Run. That's why the killer was also referred to as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The killer gained his nickname after his custom of dismembering all of his victims, 7 men and 5 women, who were all found in pieces here, there, and everywhere. The hand that killed them obviously knew a lot about anatomy, just as Jack the Ripper had. As happened in London, the Cleveland Ripper chose poor, disenfranchised people as his victims. Modern researchers have called such people less dead because when they're dead, they don't matter as much as other folks with a higher social status. The Kingsbury Run area was then known as the Hobo Jungle, famous for its gambling dens, raucous brothels, vagrants, booze, and nightly punch-ups. It was one of the so-called Hoovervilles, depressed and often violent shantytowns that popped up all over the U.S. during the era of the Great Depression. Still, the authorities did try to get the man. They even put Elliot Ness on the case, the leader of the so-called Untouchables that went after the illegal booze maverick Al Capone during Prohibition. It was the sheer gruesomeness of the case that compelled the U.S. government to send their best man. In September 1934, a woman who was in her mid-30s was found. Well, her torso and thighs were, which were reported back then as rotting slabs of human flesh, found on the shores of Lake Erie. 2 fishermen on Lake Erie later said they found her head bobbing up and down in the water. She became known as the Lady of the Lake after a young girl swimming in the lake said she saw a hand waving at her from the water. What's notable is that the coroner, Mr. A.J. Pierce, said there were signs of a preservative chemical on the skin of the victim. Where would one find such chemicals? You'll see soon. It was about a year later that 2 young men were found, each missing their head. One body had been drained of blood. Coroner Pierce said the cause of death was decapitation. The victim was later identified as 28-year-old Edward Andrassy, described by newspapers and cops as a snotty punk who occasionally got involved with prostitution and weed. The other body, which had signs of a chemical preservative on the skin, was not identified. Both men were also missing their manhood. Notably, unlike Jack the Ripper, the mutilations happened while the men were still alive, but the decapitation part was given as the actual cause of death. This was utterly brutal, but cops believed the killer must have drugged the victims first. The Cleveland News at the time had asked, what fantastic chemistry of the civilized mind converted him into a human butcher? In January, June, and July of 1936, more bodies were found, and the signature of the murders was the same. They were headless, and if they were men, they were found missing their genitals. In September of that year, a man tripped over something while trying to hop onto a train. He soon realized it was the upper half of a person's torso. When the police were recovering the other half from a muddy pool nearby, 600 people turned up to watch. The case shook America. Still, the Cleveland Ripper, while arguably 100 times worse than Jack in terms of severity, was not major global news. His story was never printed on thousands and thousands of newspapers or even given the major Hollywood blockbuster treatment. Despite Ness's efforts, including 5,000 interviews, he couldn't get his man. He decided the best thing to do was burn the entire shanty town down, making very poor people even more desperate in the process. Even back then, such a hardline act elicited widespread criticism. Ness was made more furious in 1938 when the killer left 2 of his victims, or parts of them, right near City Hall in clear view of Ness's office. This was an obvious taunt. Body parts were now being found on local streets. As one writer explained, they were literally tripping over bodies. In 1939, County Sheriff Martin O'Donnell arrested a 52-year-old bricklayer named Frank Dolezal, who was thought to be a potential suspect. He made a confession which some say now was staged. Cops broke 6 of his ribs, after which Dolezal was found dead in his jail cell. That hardly sounded like top detective work. The press then wrote about a mysterious man they called the Dr. X, an alcoholic physician that had lost his mind and eventually his practicing license. His name was Francis Edward Sweeney, a well-known member of an influential Cleveland family, and was the cousin to the U.S. Congressman Martin L. Sweeney. Francis was a veteran of World War I and no doubt suffered from what we now call PTSD. He drank all day, often flying into blind rages. He was crushed by anxiety and depression. He also had nerve damage from a gas attack in the trenches. What's more, he worked as part of a medic unit which performed amputations in the war. After the war, he worked in a hospital. Between 1933 and 1938, when the murders happened, Sweeney's erratic behavior at the hospital resulted in 5 competency hearings. He barely passed each one. A man also accused Sweeney of once drugging him. This man claimed to have been given the drugs in an office, which was Sweeney's, and just so happened to be next to the coroner's room where sharp scalpels and preservative chemicals could be found. Sweeney also failed a polygraph test once he became a prime suspect. Still, Ness didn't think he had much of a chance of convicting a man of such high standing in Cleveland. Before he could be tried, Sweeney committed himself to a mental hospital from where he wrote Ness threatening letters for years to come. There was only ever circumstantial evidence against him though, so Sweeney was never charged. It's worth noting that as soon as Sweeney committed himself, the murders stopped. Now for the exceptionally grisly murders that inspired many of the horror movies you've enjoyed. Still, we bet you've never even heard these stories before. American Maniacs and Mad Axe Murderers. On May 23, 1918, husband and wife Joseph and Catherine Maggio were sleeping soundly in their bed in New Orleans when a mysterious man walked up to them and slit their throats with a very sharp razor. For good measure, he took an axe to them. Joseph actually lived long enough for his brothers to discover him crawling around, although he died soon after. The killer became known as the Axeman of New Orleans, who may have hacked and killed 6 and injured 6 more. He, or someone pretending to be him, once wrote a letter that was published in the local newspapers, in which he threatened to besmear New Orleans with blood and brains if he didn't see jazz being played on a particular night all over the city. That night, every bar, every hotel, and even people in their homes listened to jazz. He didn't kill anyone that night. This was shocking to Americans all over the country, but in those days, they were hearing more and more about crazed killers than they had in the past, particularly axe murderers. According to serial killer researcher Peter Vronsky in his book Sons of Cain, between 1900 and 1950, the U.S. saw an increase in serial killers, and many of them chose the axe as their preferred tool for their nasty deeds. In that half-decade, Vronsky counts 171 serial killers, or 3.4 new ones every year. Other researchers have written that there were particular bad runs from 1911 to 1915 and also from 1935 to 1941. It seems war years were bad years, but that's hardly surprising given the madness of war. But there was one axe murderer that came before the two wars. He was later referred to as the Servant Girl Annihilator. A cool title for a video game, but a scary one for a person to have. This killer struck between 1884 and 1885 in Austin, Texas. And guess what? People started saying it was England's Jack the Ripper, who may or may not have decided that the weather was much better over the pond. In 1885, the New York Times wrote that two servant women in Austin were dragged from their beds and murdered. The article said, "The crimes of last night surpass all others in brutality." The Times said, "The servant women of Austin had been under attack for over a year." The article said 7 black women and 4 white women had been killed the same way, mutilated by an axe. The article explained that most of the women had been outraged, which back then meant something very different from what it means today. We think you can guess what that entailed. We'll just say it had to do with indecency. There's no need to go into details. Word spread about the attacker. Everyone had their own theory about who it was. Some of the African American community who practiced voodoo thought the killer was a white man who had magic powers to make himself invisible. Otherwise, they said, how do you explain how he got in and out without even making a dog bark? Indeed, this guy was like a ghost. Hundreds of cops were then assigned to look for the man. Some thought there might be a group of men doing it and that there was some kind of dark conspiracy. No one was ever convicted. As we said, axes were often the weapon of choice, likely because axes were everywhere in those days, and perhaps there were copycats. A man named Henry Lee Moore would walk into people's houses and massacre everyone with an axe, usually one he found lying around near the house. He'd just knock on the door and proceed to murder everyone. This is the theory. There could have been multiple mad axemen. The theory states he killed 23 people in total, all with an axe. In September 1911, he chose a house in Colorado Springs, using a handy axe to kill the father, mother, and 4 kids. A month later, he traveled to Illinois, where he did the same to a family of 3. That same month, he massacred a family of 5 in Ellsworth, Kansas. He went to Villisca, Iowa in 1912, when his axe rampage killed 6 members of a family and 2 of their guests. Moore was a prime suspect for that one, but was never convicted. There are so many axe murders back then that it's very likely that some of these deaths were caused by copycat killers. Moore was only arrested after he murdered his mother and grandmother, and even then, the cops didn't immediately link the crimes with the other axe murders. This is sometimes called linkage blindness. In the early 19th century, cops from different states didn't collude. They barely even linked anything if it happened in another state. On July 4, 1911, the Baltimore Sun ran a story about another axe killer. It was said the victim so far had been mixed race, although some later stories refute that. The axe killer was very much real, though. The so-called Atlanta Ripper sent shockwaves throughout the city. People were afraid to leave their houses. The maniac was doing terrible things to these people's bodies with his axe. A daughter of one victim survived an attack, describing the man as a large black man who was powerfully built and neatly dressed. But no one was ever convicted for these horrific murders that took 21 people. Police didn't even know if they'd all been committed by the same person. The question should also be asked, did the cops try very hard given the victims were poor and, in this case, black? Were they less dead? In 1911 and 1912, there were equally brutal murders, 49 in Louisiana and Texas. Again, the killer walked into family houses, probably just after knocking on the door, and then wiped everyone out in the most extreme fashion. In San Antonio, this axe killer, or someone copying him, murdered a family of 5. It's likely the same killer returned to the city the next year and axed to death another family of 5, and then 3 days later, in Hempstead, did the same to a family of 3. In Louisiana, he slaughtered the 3 members of the Byers family. In February 1911, he killed a family of 4 in Lafayette, and later in November, he returned to the same city and chopped and slaughtered a family of 6. Over in Denver and Colorado Springs that year, 7 women were bludgeoned to death by an axeman or an axewoman. In just about all of these cases, no money or valuables were taken from the houses. This was a time of axe madness, recently discussed in the book The Axes of Evil. Back then, the stories barely even made it out of the state, never mind being exported worldwide. They were likely the work of males, since males generally kill more than women. These days, only about 17% of all serial murders in the U.S. are committed by women. About 10% of all murders in the U.S., serial or not, are committed by women. We don't know the stats for the early 1900s, but we can be sure women did kill back then. Still, we imagine there were more mad axe men than mad axe women. All ethnicities have had their serial killers throughout American history. White males have made up the brunt of American serial killers. African Americans, according to Scientific American, comprise the largest racial minority group among serial killers, representing approximately 20% of the total. Still, it's mostly white males whose murderousness gets turned into movies and TV shows. It's also interesting that the data shows that serial killers tend to kill people of their own ethnicity. Oftentimes, they start in places they're familiar with, but then expand to new areas as they progress. What's important is that the American serial killer was becoming something of a household celebrity in the early 20th century, more so than in other countries, which might be one reason why the US has way more reported serial killers than anywhere else. We have to make this distinction because while it seems like the US is the serial killer capital of the world, that's not the whole truth. According to data from the Radford University Serial Killer Information Center, the U.S. is top with 3,204 recorded serial killers since serial killers started being recorded. Keep in mind that the U.S. was one of the first countries to recognize the phenomenon of serial killers, so data from the U.S. started to be collected a lot earlier than in other countries. England, which is super close to the U.S. in cultural terms, was next with just 166 serial killers, but if we take population into account, this figure is not as impressive considering the US has around 5 times as many people. No country, large or small, can touch the US where serial killers are concerned. Although for countries with larger populations, like India and China, we have to keep in mind the previously mentioned population difference. Maybe the US is a country where serial killing for fame has become attractive to many people, because it wouldn't make sense that the US just breeds more natural-born killers than other nations. Or maybe countries with similar or larger populations are underreporting or just not publishing their serial killer data, and countries with strict media censorship are not letting the stories get out there. The second seems a lot more likely. The Doodler. The Doodler was like no one else. He was the artistic type, which you don't often find with serial killers. In 1974 and 1975, he murdered between 6 and 16 men in San Francisco, with each victim showing similar types of stab wounds. He met the men in areas known for the city's gay scene. The reason he got the name the Doodler is that one of the men he assaulted but failed to kill said he met the man while he was sketching caricatures. Police say they had a good description of the Doodler. They say he was 19 to 25 years old. He was described as black, lanky, and around 6 feet tall. Police have also released a sketch of what the man might look like now in his early to mid-60s. One of the problems with the case is some of the witnesses were not willing to testify since they wanted to keep the fact that they were homosexual under wraps. In fact, investigators said they were pretty sure their suspect was guilty, but they had their hands tied as some witnesses just wouldn't have their day in court. In 1977, the Associated Press wrote, "Murder suspect free because gay is silent." Such a headline didn't seem fair to some people. The activist Harvey Milk, who became San Francisco's city supervisor only to be assassinated in 1978, said there was pressure on the men. They had families to think about, wives and children. So, this is a strange one. Police think they know who killed those men but are powerless to do anything about it. The case is still open, with detectives now trying to secure a conviction through DNA technology. As things stand, serial killing only makes up about 1% of all the murders in the US. The National Vital Statistics System said in 2021 there were 26,031 homicides in the US. So that would mean, if FBI estimates are correct, about 260 of them would be the work of active serial killers. The FBI said before that at any given time there are between 25 and 50 serial killers operating in the US. By the end of the show, you'll believe that's a fact. You might also believe the estimate is too low. Obviously, these numbers can change year to year, and it's not an exact science. 1970 to 2000 saw a bumper crop of serial killers. This is referred to as the golden age of serial killers. And we wonder why there are so many serial killers in the USA. These days, it's much harder to go around chopping people up with axes, as there are so many CCTV and other cameras around. The axe murder of Texas and Louisiana wouldn't have gotten far in 2023, not with smart doorbells and such. It's sometimes said there are 70 million surveillance cameras in the US, although the number changes a lot depending on the source. Still, you're never far away from a camera. Serial killers are now at least more forensically aware, and they pick their moments and places better, as you'll soon see. Now let's turn our focus outside of the US. Bible John. Imagine if you were a woman and you were on the dance floor of a nightclub dancing across from a good-looking fella. He then went over to you and shouted in your ear, "If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death." What a turn-on that'd be. The guy's a hottie for sure, so despite his strange sweet talk and the fact that he won't even have a drink, you decide to go home with him. On the taxi ride there, he's suddenly very quiet. Then all of a sudden, he leans into you and whispers, "To preserve you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress, do not desire her beauty in your heart, and do not let her capture you with her eyelashes." You'd be somewhat turned off, which is how we imagine the three women felt who'd met Scotland's notorious Bible John at a ballroom in Glasgow in the late 1960s, a place Bible John told a victim's sister was an adulterous den of iniquity. This guy got his strange nickname because women who met him before he killed his third victim said he'd introduced himself as John, only to start quoting the Old Testament on the topic of adultery. In the taxi with the last victim, he told one of her friends, "I don't drink, I pray." John beat and strangled his dates just minutes from their homes. This should have been a fairly easy case. Many people had seen him. He was obviously very religious. He was young and handsome. A sketch of him was seen by just about every person in Glasgow, while hundreds of men stood in lineups. Yet Bible John disappeared, and he remains on the loose today. Or more likely he's dead, not in ballroom heaven, but in disco hell. The Butcher of Mons. The same goes for the Butcher of Mons in Belgium. He just disappeared. From January 1996 to July 1997, he dismembered 5 women with what police said was precision skill. The killer put various parts of their bodies into bags, where after people found them, some containing feet or a head, and some hands and organs. He didn't even hide the bags, he just left them close to the road. The case remains a mystery today. Cops have no idea who committed the crimes. There is ample evidence that serial killers don't just get bored and start having scruples. Killing is addictive. Once they start, they can't stop. What do you think happened to this Belgium Ripper? The vending machine killer. It was a similar story for cops in Japan, who investigated a case in the 1980s in which 12 people were murdered and 35 more were made seriously ill when a killer put poisoned drinks in the troughs of vending machines. The victims would buy a drink and then discover there were 2 drinks in the trough, possibly believing they'd got 2 for 1. Unbeknownst to the victim, the free one had been laced with dangerous herbicides. This man became known as the vending machine killer. Why he stopped, no one knows. What's worrying is there are copycats in Japan. A new kind of serial killer was born. The New York Times in 1985 quoted a Japanese psychologist who said there was a new breed of thrill-seeking criminal in Japan known as Yukai-Han. The psychologist said they cynically enjoy superiority by imagining the victims groaning and do not feel any remorse. This reminded the Americans of the so-called Tylenol poisonings, in which the killer laced the drug Tylenol with potassium cyanide in various parts of Chicago. 7 people, most of them in their 20s and 30s, all bought spiked Tylenol capsules and died from September to October 1982. In those days, you could just open the bottle and put it back on the shelf. Mary Lynn Reiner bought some regular Tylenol capsules at Frank's Finer Foods, took 2, and fell into a coma. Teresa Janis took 1 pill around dinner time. She told her husband Frank her chest hurt. She was dead just after midnight. No one was ever caught, but what's really disturbing is there were copycats. People saw the news about the murders on TV or read about it in a newspaper, and instead of naturally feeling shocked or upset, they went out and did the same thing. A year later, in 1986, a young woman in Yonkers, New York, took 2 tablets of extra-strength Tylenol that had been laced with cyanide. She died soon after. The New York Times said the FBI had found a second bottle of extra-strength Tylenol capsules laced with cyanide that had been seized from a store in Westchester County. Like the Chicago crimes, no one was ever convicted. Police later said there were hundreds of similar cases throughout the U.S., which led to changes in how Americans took their meds. It might have also inspired the vending machine killer. Again, it is worth noting that there was a significant increase in serial killings when global media exploded right at the time of Jack the Ripper. Sure, there were serial killings in the 17th and 18th centuries, sometimes called vampires or werewolves, but when newspapers took over the world, serial killers got going. The Danilovsky Maniac. Russia's Danilovsky Maniac killed at least 7 people from 2004 to 2007 in the city of Cherepovets in the Vologda Oblast. Despite a massive investigation, no one has ever been caught. Seems the killer had a change of mind, unlikely, or died or went to prison. The Stone Man. Did the Stone Man in India just stop, or did he die or go to prison? In 1989, this guy went up to people sleeping in the street in Calcutta and dropped a massive stone on their heads. The cop said he was probably quite strong since the average stone weight was about 30 kilograms or 66 pounds. There were similar murders in other Indian cities, quite a lot in Mumbai, but no one was ever caught. The Monster of the Mangones. There was a killer in Colombia who was active between 1963 and 1974 and had the whole country in a state of shock. Some people thought stories about him were so far out that he was a myth. He wasn't. This so-called monster of the Mangones should not have come as much of a surprise. After all, Colombia is infamous for its prolific serial killers. Two of the most prolific in history are Luis Garavito, aka the Beast, who viciously tortured and killed as many as 300 young men, with 142 convictions in the late 1990s. He really was a beast, the sadist of the highest degree, who often amputated parts of his victims before allowing them to die. Pedro Alonso Lopez, aka the Monster of the Andes, chose girls and young women as his victims, as many as 350 from 1969 to 1980 in various South American countries. But get this, he only spent 14 years in prison in Ecuador and another 4 years in a mental hospital in Colombia. He was released on a $70 bail order in 1998. Lo and behold, he disappeared and didn't see his parole officer again. Interpol and the Colombian National Police now want him in connection with some new murders. As for the monster of the Mangones, he would shove needles into his male victims' throats and draw out blood. He may have drank the blood, making his murders partly an act of vampirism. He killed up to 38 guys like this and dumped many of their bodies down an alley locally known as the Mangones. Jack the Ripper of Rwanda. We don't have time to cover every country, but we think you need to know about the so-called Jack the Ripper of Rwanda. Rwanda is now an infinitely safer place than it was back in the 90s, when in 94 there was genocide. But in the capital of Kigali, where prostitution is said to be rife, there's a new version of the Ripper. On August 28, 2012, this guy killed 2 sex workers in the poorer part of town in broad daylight. Another woman saw the act, so he killed her too. It's reported he's killed 18 women so far, but what shocked Rwandans the most is on one of the victims' flesh he carved the words, "I will stop once I have killed 400 prostitutes." The New Times of Rwanda said eyewitnesses have seen this guy many times, who's described as a slender, light-skinned man who appears to be in his early 30s. Some people accused the cops of not looking hard enough given the social standing of the victims. Police responded to these slights by saying the government of Rwanda values every person living in Rwanda regardless of what they do. Police said the reason for the murders is likely conflicts over money and revenge following an HIV/AIDS contamination. 45.8% of sex workers are HIV positive and apparently at the root of the problem. But his criminal profile might also meet the criteria for the missionary killer, a special kind of serial killer who tells himself he's on a mission to exterminate something he feels is evil, dangerous, or just bad. The next story is so horrible it would shock Ted Bundy. The Forest of Horror. In 2014, Nigerian media reported about the Ibadan House of Horror in the city of Ibadan, Oyo State in Nigeria, the country's third largest city. The house had been used for human sacrifices. All around it were buried bodies and body parts in various states of decomposition, including skeletons. Inside the house were 21, maybe 23 victims, many shackled and driven half-mad by despair. The entire area stank of rotting corpses. One Nigerian writer summed it up saying, "No adjective or description is too much to express the horror." A Nigerian newspaper said the police rescued no fewer than 20 corpses and 21 living persons described as lunatics in various horrible health conditions from the scene. The discovery of so many human skulls and the continued exhuming of many more point to the idea that the spot might have existed for a long time. The discovery caused small riots. Families soon asked if their loved ones who'd gone missing had ended up at this horrible house of torture and death. Worse, the Nigerian media and some of the public pointed to wealthy people and even officials and politicians who were accused of hiring kidnappers to find young folks for their sacrifices, which were believed to bring them good fortune. Police still haven't found the culprits, but it's widely believed people of high standing are behind this obscene set of crimes that have gone on for years and possibly claimed hundreds of victims. Some of the victims said, indeed, when they were kidnapped, the people taking them had said they were officials. This case remains a mystery, but according to the press and the public, something stinks to high heaven here. Someone knows more than they're letting on. Now for some killers you might bump into one night on your way home from work. The West Mesa Bone Collector. In 2009, out in the desert of West Mesa in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a woman's dog dug up a bone. It was a human bone. Police got on the case, and soon the remains of 11 women aged between 15 and 32 were found after a crime scene said to be as large as 75 football fields was cordoned off for the dig. It was believed most of the victims were sex workers. One of the victims was 4 months pregnant at the time of her death. A news reporter wrote, "All young women heinously murdered and then deep-sixed into the grit in a forlorn desert. Their families claimed the local police made no effort to find them after they were reported missing. Was this the work of human traffickers, a deranged serial killer, or perhaps drug lords? It was said these women knew each other. They worked the streets and scored drugs in what's sometimes referred to as Albuquerque's war zone. How had they ended up in the ground not far from each other? There have been plenty of suspects, and yet again the case remains open. This next one will chill you to the bone. The Colonial Parkway Killer. You've heard of the Zodiac Killer, but we doubt many of you have heard of the Colonial Parkway Killer. You'll likely recall the movie Zodiac, which shows the Zodiac Killer shooting a couple in a car parked down a lover's lane. This happened in real life. That's what the Colonial Parkway Killer did too, down a dark, mostly deserted road called the Colonial Parkway in Virginia. But he did it to 3 couples, killing them all, while another couple went missing. The murders happened between 1986 and 1989. They might have all been the work of one man, but since the deaths involved strangulation, gunshot, as well as stabbings, they might have also been the work of multiple killers taking advantage of the very dark stretch of road. Then again, in each case, the victims weren't robbed, and each time the killer drove their car away. In the first case in October 1986, the victims were both United States Naval Academy Class of 1981 graduates. Kathy and Becky were a gay couple who at some point during the night must have been approached by a man, perhaps armed with a gun. Both victims were found with rope burns on their wrists and necks. They'd both been slashed so violently that they were almost decapitated. The killer then doused their bodies in gasoline, although he didn't light it. There might be other victims of the same killer not part of his official 8 count, such as 25-year-old Brian Craig Pettinger, who'd been hogtied and thrown into a river while still alive, or 18-year-old Lori Ann Powell Compton, who'd slammed a car door shut on her boyfriend after an argument and walked off into the night, only to be found later with stab wounds in her back. Maybe the killer struck again in 1996. That year, the bodies of 24-year-old Julianne Marie Williams and 26-year-old Laurel Salisbury Winans were discovered. The two had been camping in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park. Like some of the other victims, they were bound and stabbed. Like those other people, the killer wasn't directly sexually motivated. Now for perhaps the strangest case of them all, and arguably the one you should be the most concerned about. All you good-looking sporty types out there, listen carefully. The Smiley Face Killer. The story of the Smiley Face Killer is like a campfire horror tale you tell to your friends. It's a movie, a myth, and yet it might just be real. It's the story of at least 3 dozen young white men who in the 1990s and 2000s, up until the present day, were all found drowned in a body of water. The cases were mysterious, given that the men could swim and no one saw them fall into the water. Some people blamed booze and the hijinks young guys are apt to get up to, but others found the cases very, very strange. 3 dozen mysterious drownings of a similar kinds of young men is a lot, and there might be dozens more. One of the reasons this has been blamed on a serial killer or a group of connected serial killers is the fact that next to or near where the men drowned, there was always a smiley face piece of graffiti drawn on the wall. Something like 45 males have been found dead in the water in 11 states, often seen last at a party or a bar. The smiley face was always nearby. Detectives who worked on the case noted that these men fit a certain kind of profile. They were successful, popular, sporty types, the kind of guys some people might resent. 19 of these dead men were found in just 2 states, Minnesota and Wisconsin, but the detectives believe the killers have struck all over the U.S. One of those detectives said he's sure there's a well-structured, organized gang with cells in major cities across the U.S. who drug, abduct, hold the victims for a period of time before they murder them and then place them in the water. This isn't a joke, they are deadly serious. Some critics of the detective's theory believe the smiley face is so common, it's just a coincidence the men died close to where they were painted. Others have argued that it wasn't always possible to know exactly where the men died. The FBI has said it has no evidence there was a serial killer, stating these instances appear to be alcohol-related drownings. Tell that to the family and friends of a young man named Dakota James, who on December 15, 2016 called his friend Shelly on the phone sometime in the evening. Dakota was in total panic, crying. He told her, "I don't know where I am. I'm so cold. Please help me, I'm lost." He sounded unbelievably desperate. She found him by using a cell phone location app. He was somewhere on Pittsburgh's south side, still in shock. He hardly spoke at first, but told her the police had refused to help him. He'd actually asked them for help, and they just shrugged him off. Dakota explained to Shelly he'd been at a work Christmas party hosted by the transport company he worked at, and the last time he remembered anything was about 7:15 p.m. 4 hours later, he was walking around Pittsburgh not knowing where he'd been or what he was doing. Shelly thought it might have been a matter of too much booze, or maybe at worst he'd been drugged, but Dakota seemed okay the next day. 5 weeks later, he went missing, and this time Shelly would not get a call. On March 6, 2017, some 40 days later, a woman walking her dog found Dakota bloated and dead in the Ohio River. During the autopsy, the powerful general anesthetic GHB, known as the data salt drug, was found in his system. Did Dakota run into the same people as he did 5 weeks earlier? Had he been stalked? Had he actually been lucky to survive the first attack at his work party? He was young, good-looking, and athletic, the profile that fit the victims of the smiley face killer. His PayPal account had been used just 2 days after he'd vanished. His body certainly had not been in the water for 40 days, according to pathologists, so where had he been for 40 days? Why hadn't he called home? He wouldn't do that kind of thing. His death had been ruled an accident, but a pathologist named Cyril Wecht, who later reviewed his case, said Dakota had ligature marks on his neck. And guess what? On the closest bridge to where he was found, the Roberto Clemente Bridge, there were 11 smiley face symbols spray painted onto the concrete. This bridge was a few miles away, but it was still the closest bridge to where Dakota was found, and where police say he fell in. By now, you guys watching this video understand very well how serial killers copy each other. They watch something on the news and they replicate it. For power, for infamy, to satiate a sick urge. That's what some detectives think has happened here. That in the USA, there were and maybe still are ruthless and brutal people killing for fun and drawing a smiley face near to where they dumped the bodies. Now retired, these detectives say the smiley face killers have murdered around 100 people and they've linked 250 cases to them in total. One of the detectives is so sure of this that he's remortgaged his house and maxed his credit cards trying to solve the case. Both detectives say this depraved gang is highly organized, using various medications on people, stalking them, and choosing a specific target, with each murder being meticulously planned on the dark web. One of the detectives said in an interview in 2019, the level of sophistication of the group is a lot greater than we'd imagined. Now we know they communicate with each other on the dark web. We know there's surveillance and counter-surveillance. Maybe the FBI is right, and there are about 250 murders a year that are the work of American serial killers, or maybe something much darker lurks behind the headlines that we see in our day-to-day media. Now you really have to watch how these sneaky serial killers finally got caught, or get to know what the profilers and detectives do, and how serial killer profilers actually catch serial killers.